Hello everyone, tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, it really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Road That Remembers, from Marcus Wheeler. The CB radio crackled with static as I adjusted the frequency, searching for any driver willing to share the lonely hours between Bakersfield and nowhere. My Peterbilt's headlights carved through the Nevada darkness, illuminating endless stretches of asphalt that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the western states. But tonight felt different somehow. The familiar weight of my trailer felt heavier. The engine's rumble seemed muted, and even the dashboard lights appeared dimmer than usual. The digital clock read 2:47 a.m. when I first noticed the peculiar sign ahead. Unlike the standard green highway markers I had grown accustomed to, this one stood alone against the star-scattered sky, its white letters spelling out Mercy Falls, 12 miles, in simple block text. The strange thing was, I'd never seen this exit before. Despite having traveled this exact stretch of Highway 50 countless times, I reached for my atlas, the worn pages crackling as I flipped through the Nevada section, but found no mention of any town called Mercy Falls anywhere along this route. The radio suddenly burst to life with a voice I didn't recognize, gravelly and weathered like an old leather jacket left too long in the sun. "Eastbound Peterbilt, you copy? This is Phantom Ridge, mile marker 247. I glanced at my odometer and felt a chill run down my spine. Mile marker 247 was exactly where I was, but I couldn't see any other trucks on the road ahead or behind me. The desert stretched endlessly in both directions, empty except for the occasional tumbleweed dancing across my path. "Go ahead, Phantom Ridge," I responded, my voice echoing strangely in the cab. "This is Big Rig Marcus." "I've got your 20, but I don't see you out here." The reply came through layers of static, as if transmitted from somewhere very far away. "You heading toward Mercy Falls, Marcus? That last turn before the road ends?" There was something in his voice that made the hair on my arms stand up, a kind of knowing sadness that spoke of experience I didn't want to understand. I pressed the transmit button again. "Negative, Phantom Ridge. Just passing through to Reno. Never heard of Mercy Falls." But even as I spoke the words, I found my eyes drawn to that mysterious sign growing larger in my windshield. The exit ramp curved away into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach, disappearing behind a low ridge that hadn't been visible from a distance. Something about that turn called to me like a melody half remembered from childhood. "Every driver finds Mercy Falls eventually," the voice continued, and now I could hear what sounded like wind whistling through the transmission, though my windows were closed tight against the desert cold. "It's the last turn before disappearing. Some folks say it's where the road dreams about the trucks that never made it home." The signal faded after that, leaving me alone with the steady thrum of my engine and the whisper of tires on weathered asphalt. I should have kept driving straight. Every rational part of my mind screamed to maintain course toward Reno, to stick to the familiar route that would have me unloading cargo by dawn. But something deeper than logic guided my hands as I activated the turn signal, its rhythmic clicking marking time like a metronome counting down to an inevitable conclusion. The exit ramp rose gently from the main highway, and as I navigated the curve, my headlights swept across a landscape that seemed frozen in time. The road beyond the ramp was narrower than modern highways, built from an older style of concrete that had aged to a pale gray. Ancient telephone poles lined the route, their wires sagging between crooked wooden posts like musical staff lines waiting for notes that would never come. The desert here felt different too, populated not with the usual scrub brush and cacti, but with gnarled trees whose branches reached toward my truck like arthritic fingers. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles ahead, I could see the faint glow of electric lights marking what I assumed must be the town of Mercy Falls. As I downshifted and settled into the slower pace demanded by the winding road, I began to notice details that didn't quite fit with the landscape I thought I knew. Road signs appeared at regular intervals, but they were crafted from materials and in styles I hadn't seen since I was a child riding with my grandfather in his old Kenworth. Mercy Falls, 8 miles, read 1, its reflective letters somehow managing to shine brighter than they should have given their obvious age. Another warned of steep grades and dangerous curves, in language that seemed formal and overly courteous, like something from a bygone era, when people still believed in dignity and respect for the road itself. The radio remained silent, despite my attempts to raise other drivers or even catch some late-night music from distant stations. The only sounds were the mechanical symphony of my truck and the increasingly strange acoustics of the world outside my windows. Trees seemed to whisper as I passed, and once I could have sworn I heard the distant echo of another diesel engine. Though I saw no other vehicles on the road, the loneliness felt heavier here, more substantial, as if solitude itself had weight and presence. When I crested a small hill about 3 miles from town, I got my first clear view of Mercy Falls, and what I saw made me ease off the accelerator until my Peterbilt was barely crawling forward. The town spread across a shallow valley like a photograph from the 1950s, complete with neon signs advertising motor lodges and diners, their colors bleeding into the darkness with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. Everything appeared preserved in perfect condition, from the chrome-trimmed buildings to the vintage automobiles parked along wide streets. Yet something about the scene felt fundamentally wrong, like a movie set viewed from too close a distance. Main Street ran straight through the center of town, lined with establishments that seemed purpose-built for travelers. The Io Rancho Motel boasted vacancy in flashing red letters, while Betty's all-night diner promised hot coffee and fresh pie beneath a sign shaped like a coffee cup. At the far end of the business district, perhaps half a mile away, the road simply stopped at what appeared to be a massive wall of darkness, as if the world itself ended at the city limits. No matter how hard I strained my eyes, I couldn't make out anything beyond that final intersection, not even stars or the suggestion of distant mountains. I parked my rig in front of the diner, the air brakes releasing with their familiar hiss into the unnaturally quiet night. The absence of sound was more disturbing than any noise might have been. No insects chirped, no wind rustled through the carefully maintained streets, and even my own footsteps seemed muffled as I walked toward the diner's entrance. The building's interior glowed with warm yellow light, and through the windows I could see comfortable booths and a long counter lined with chrome stools, but no people were visible anywhere. The door opened at my touch, triggering a cheerful bell that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Inside, the diner was a masterpiece of mid-century American design, complete with black and white checkered floors, red vinyl seats, and a jukebox that glowed with internal light but played no music. Coffee sat brewing behind the counter, filling the air with rich aroma, and I could see fresh pies displayed in a glass case, their crusts golden and inviting. Yet despite all these signs of recent activity, I remained utterly alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the empty space. No answer came, but I noticed that one of the booths held a cup of coffee that was still steaming, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. On the table beside it lay a trucker's logbook, open to entries dated from different decades spanning back 40 years. Each page contained the same final entry, last turn to Mercy Falls, end of route. The handwriting changed from entry to entry, but the words remained exactly the same. A movement outside caught my attention through the diner's front window. My truck's running lights were still on, casting red and amber glows across the empty street, but now I could see other vehicles parked in the shadows. Big rigs from different eras sat silent along the curbs, their chrome dulled with age, but their form still proud and dignified. A Kenworth from the 1970S sat next to a modern Freightliner, which neighbored what looked like a Mack truck from the 1960s. All bore different company logos and paint schemes, but they shared one common feature that made my blood run cold. Each truck's cab was empty, doors closed, as if their drivers had simply vanished into the Nevada night. I backed away from the window, suddenly desperate to return to the relative safety of my own truck. The diner no longer felt welcoming, but instead seemed like a trap designed to look comfortable while concealing darker purposes. As I reached for the Dawn Runner's Last Mile from Marcus Webb, I've been running freight across the Midwest for 17 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these highways had to offer. Night shifts were my specialty, hauling loads from Chicago to Denver and back again, watching the world transform in that magical hour when darkness begins its slow retreat to morning. My Peterbilt 389 and I had become creatures of that liminal time, that sacred space between night and day when the world holds its breath. But there's one run I made last September that changed everything I thought I knew about the road. The assignment seemed routine enough, a priority delivery of agricultural equipment bound for a farm supply company outside Sterling, Colorado. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my CB with an urgency that made me sit up straighter in my driver's seat. They needed this load delivered by 6 a.m. sharp, no exceptions, no delays. The timeline was tight, but I'd made tighter runs before. What struck me as odd was the complete lack of traffic information, weather updates, or the usual chatter that fills the airwaves during overnight hauls. The radio had fallen into an eerie silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I pulled out of the Chicago depot at 11 p.m., my diesel engine purring with that familiar rumble that had become my lullaby over the years. The weather was perfect for night driving, clear skies with just enough coolness in the air to keep me alert without needing the heater. My headlights carved through the darkness as I settled into the rhythm that every long-haul driver knows, that meditative state where the road becomes an extension of your consciousness and the truck becomes an extension of your body. The first few hours passed without incident. Interstate 80 stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, occasionally punctuated by the distant glow of truck stops and the brief passage of oncoming headlights. I made good time through Illinois and into Iowa, my CB picking up the usual late-night conversations between drivers, reports of speed traps, weather conditions ahead, and the general camaraderie that makes these lonely hours bearable. But somewhere around 3 a.m. as I crossed into Nebraska, something began to change. The chatter on the CB grew sporadic, then stopped altogether. At first, I attributed it to atmospheric conditions, or simply being in a dead zone between repeater towers. But as the miles rolled beneath my wheels, the silence became more pronounced, more deliberate. It was as if I had somehow driven into a pocket of the world where sound itself had been muffled. Even my engine seemed quieter, its familiar diesel growl reduced to a whisper that barely registered above the hum of my tires on asphalt. That's when I first noticed the other truck. It appeared in my side mirror just as I was checking my position near Grand Island. At first glance, it looked like any other big rig, a dark silhouette maintaining a steady distance behind me in the right lane. But something about its presence felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what was troubling me. The headlights were too dim, barely visible against the pre-dawn darkness, and there was something about the way it moved that suggested a weightlessness that defied physics. I tried raising the driver on the CB, cycling through all the common channels, but received no response. The radio crackled with static, an empty white noise that seemed to grow louder the longer I listened. I adjusted my mirrors to get a better look at the trailing vehicle, but the image remained frustratingly unclear, as if I were trying to focus on something that existed just slightly beyond normal perception. Miles passed, and the mysterious truck maintained its distance with mechanical precision. No matter how I adjusted my speed, whether accelerating up hills or coasting down gentle slopes, it remained exactly where it had first appeared, like a dark shadow tethered to my own vehicle. The consistency of its position began to gnaw at me, that subtle wrongness growing into genuine unease as the night deepened around us. As we approached the Colorado border, the landscape began to change. The flat expanses of Nebraska gave way to rolling hills, and the sky started showing the first hints of the approaching dawn. It was during this transition, in that magical time when night begins its retreat, that I began to notice other details about my uninvited companion that made my skin crawl with inexplicable dread. The truck cast no shadow under the occasional streetlight. When other vehicles passed in the opposite direction, their headlights would illuminate my Peterbilt clearly, but seemed to pass right through the dark vehicle behind me, as if it were made of smoke and intention, rather than steel and chrome. Yet it remained stubbornly present in my mirrors, maintaining that perfect, impossible distance. I decided to test my growing suspicions. Taking advantage of a long, empty stretch of highway, I gradually reduced my speed from 70 to 60, then to 50 miles per hour. The truck behind me slowed accordingly, maintaining that exact same spacing. Then I accelerated rapidly, pushing my loaded rig up to 75, watching my mirrors intently. The dark vehicle accelerated smoothly, keeping pace without any visible effort, its dim headlights never wavering. The real test came when I pulled into a rest area outside Sterling. I needed fuel, but more than that, I needed to confront whatever was following me. As I swung into the truck stop, I watched my mirrors carefully, waiting to see where my mysterious companion would position itself. But as my trailer cleared the highway and entered the parking area, the other truck simply vanished, disappearing as completely as if it had never existed at all. I sat in my cab for several minutes, engine idling, scanning the parking area and the highway beyond. Nothing. No sign of the vehicle that had shadowed me for over 100 miles. The CB remained silent, that unnatural quiet pressing against my consciousness like a physical weight. Other trucks were scattered around the lot, their drivers likely catching a few hours of sleep before continuing their own journeys, but none matched the configuration of my mysterious follower. Shaking off my unease, I topped off my fuel tanks and checked my load securement. Everything appeared normal, exactly as it should be. The delivery location was less than 50 miles ahead, and dawn was breaking in earnest now, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that should have been comforting. Instead, the approaching daylight seemed to carry an undercurrent of menace, as if something important was about to be revealed. I pulled back onto the highway, determined to complete my delivery and put this strange experience behind me. But as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the Colorado plains, I began to notice something that made my blood run cold. The CB, silent for hours, suddenly crackled to life with a transmission that seemed to come from impossibly far away. Breaker 19, this is the Dawn Runner, eastbound on I-76. The voice was my own, but distorted, as if filtered through distance and time. Looking for information on a priority delivery to Sterling. Anyone copy? I grabbed my microphone with trembling hands. This is also the Dawn Runner. I'm westbound, approaching Sterling now. What's your 20? Static filled the cab, then my own voice again, fainter now. I'm having some trouble with my load. Something's not right here. The paperwork doesn't match what I picked up in Chicago. With growing horror, I pulled my delivery documents from the visor. The papers I'd been given showed agricultural equipment bound for a farm supply company that, according to the address, should be just ahead. But the manifests were dated 3 years ago. The signature on the dispatch order was mine, but I had no memory of ever writing it. Dawn Runner, do you copy? My own voice echoed through the speaker, growing more desperate. I think I'm lost. The sun's coming up, but everything looks wrong. The shadows are falling the wrong way. I looked out at the landscape around me, and for the first time noticed that the shadows were indeed wrong. Despite the sun's position in the eastern sky, shadows fell toward the east, as if the light were coming from the wrong direction entirely. The wrongness of it made my vision swim, reality seeming to shift and blur at the edges. The delivery address led me down a series of increasingly narrow farm roads. each turn taking me further from the main highway and deeper into a landscape that felt subtly but fundamentally wrong. The GPS signal flickered and died. Road signs became scarce, then disappeared altogether. The few buildings I passed looked abandoned, their windows dark and their parking lots empty of everything except weeds growing through cracked asphalt. Finally, I reached the address on my manifest. What I found was not a functioning farm supply company, but the burned-out shell of a building that looked like it had been destroyed years ago. Blackened timber frames reached toward the sky like accusing fingers, and the parking area was so overgrown that I could barely make out where the pavement ended and the fields began. I sat in my cab, engine idling, staring at the ruins and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The CB crackled again, my own voice faint but clearly audible. "Made my delivery to Sterling. Something's wrong with this place. Something's very... The stop that shouldn't be." From Marcus. The thing about driving long haul for 37 years is that you learn every mile of interstate like the lines on your own palm. Every exit, every overpass, every truck stop becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. That's why when I saw the rest area on Interstate 80 that October night, the one that had never been there before, I should have kept driving. I was hauling a load of furniture from Sacramento to Chicago, running my usual route through the Nevada desert. The rain had started falling around midnight, turning the windshield into a canvas of streaking water that my wipers could barely keep up with. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a sound that had carried me through countless nights like this one. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant voices of other drivers, but mostly it was just me and the hypnotic rhythm of tires on wet asphalt. The fuel gauge showed I still had plenty of diesel, and my logbook said I had another 2 hours before I needed to rest. But something about the storm was making me uneasy. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the sagebrush and rocky outcroppings that stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway. The air felt heavy, electric, like the sky was holding its breath. That's when I saw the sign, green and reflective like any other highway sign, emerging from the darkness in my headlights. "Rest area 1 mile," it read. Below that, smaller text that I couldn't quite make out through the rain. I frowned, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I'd driven this stretch of 80 more times than I could count, and there'd never been a rest area between Winnemucca and Battle Mountain. The closest facilities were 40 miles in either direction. But there it was, as real as the rain hammering my cab. Maybe it was new construction, I reasoned. The state was always adding facilities, trying to make the long hauls safer for drivers like me. Though it seemed odd that I hadn't heard about it on the CB, or seen it mentioned in any of the trucking forums I frequented. As I crested a small hill, I saw the rest area spread out below me. Solar-powered LED lights cast a pale blue glow over the facility, and I could make out the familiar shapes of picnic tables, restrooms, and parking spaces designed for big rigs. A few cars were scattered throughout the regular parking area, their windows dark, occupants presumably sleeping. It looked normal, welcoming even, a small beacon of civilization in the vast Nevada emptiness. I downshifted and took the exit, my trailer following obediently behind. The air brakes hissed softly as I navigated the curved ramp, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized. A short break would do me good, a chance to stretch my legs and check my load before pushing on through the storm. The truck parking area was empty except for my rig, which struck me as unusual. Even at this hour, most rest stops along major interstates had at least 1 or 2 other trucks. But the storm might have kept other drivers at proper truck stops with restaurants and showers. I pulled into a space near the restrooms and killed the engine, suddenly aware of how loud the rain sounded without the diesel's rumble to mask it. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and stepped down from the cab, immediately feeling the cold October air bite through my shirt. The rain wasn't heavy, more of a persistent drizzle that seemed to hang in the air like mist. My boots crunched on gravel that seemed too fresh, too uniform, as if it had been laid down recently. The smell of wet sage and something else. Walking toward the restroom building, I noticed how clean everything looked. Too clean. Rest areas, especially ones in remote stretches like this, usually showed signs of wear, graffiti, general neglect. But this place looked like it had been built yesterday. The paint on the concrete block walls was pristine, the windows spotlessly clear, the metal fixtures on the doors free of rust despite the desert climate. The motion sensor lights clicked on as I approached, bathing me in harsh white light that made my shadow dance strangely on the wet ground. I pushed open the men's room door and it swung smoothly on hinges that didn't squeak. Inside, everything was immaculate. The tiles gleamed, the mirrors reflected without a speck or crack, and the air smelled of industrial cleanser with an underlying hint of something floral. But it was the silence that bothered me most. Rest stops are never truly quiet. There's always the hum of ventilation, the distant sound of traffic, the settling of old buildings. Here, the only sound was the soft patter of rain on the roof and the echo of my own footsteps. Even my breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I finished my business and stepped back outside, where the motion lights had turned off in my absence. They flickered back on as I emerged, but for just a moment I could have sworn I saw movement near the picnic area. Just a shadow shifting between the tables, too quick and fluid to be human. I turned my flashlight in that direction, but the beam revealed only empty concrete and wet metal. Walking back toward my truck, I decided to check on those cars I'd noticed from the highway. There were 3 of them, parked in a neat row in the regular vehicle area. A red sedan, a blue SUV, and a white compact car. All had out-of-state plates, which wasn't unusual on an interstate. But as I got closer, something felt wrong about them. The red sedan's windows were fogged over completely, but not from condensation. It looked more like frost, despite the relatively mild temperature. I wiped a small circle clear with my sleeve and peered inside. The interior was empty, but the seats and dashboard were covered with a thin layer of what looked like ice crystals. My breath caught in my throat. The car had been here long enough for some kind of sublimation to occur, but that would take weeks, maybe months in this climate. The SUV was similarly frosted, but when I cleared a spot on the windshield, I could see personal items scattered inside. A purse on the passenger seat, a child's toy on the floor, a coffee cup holder with cups that looked full, as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. The white compact car told the same story, personal effects arranged as if their owners intended to return momentarily. I backed away from the vehicles, my pulse quickening. Something was very wrong here. Cars didn't just get abandoned at rest stops with their contents intact, and that frost, that impossible frost in the desert air, made my skin crawl. I needed to get back to my truck and get back on the highway. But as I turned toward the truck parking area, I realized my Peterbilt wasn't where I'd left it. The space where I'd parked was empty, nothing but wet gravel reflecting the blue LED lights. I ran to the spot, my boots splashing through puddles that hadn't been there when I'd walked away. The gravel showed no tire tracks, no indication that an 18-wheeler had ever been parked there. Panic started to rise in my chest. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal, not even a single bar. The device felt cold in my hand, colder than the night air could account for. I walked quickly around the rest area, checking every parking spot, looking behind the restroom building, searching for any sign of my truck and trailer. That's when I noticed the sign by the exit ramp, the one that should have directed traffic back onto the interstate. Instead of the familiar green highway marker, there was a simple wooden post with a hand-painted sign that read, "No exit after dark." Below that, in smaller letters barely visible in my flashlight beam, "Thank you for stopping." The rain was getting heavier now, and the temperature seemed to be dropping rapidly. I could see my breath in the air, and the puddles around my feet were developing thin sheets of ice. The motion sensor lights began flickering erratically, casting crazy shadows that seemed to dance and writhe independently of any movement I made. I heard the sound of an engine in the distance, growing louder. Hope flared in my chest as I saw headlights approaching on the highway above. But instead of passing by, the vehicle took the exit ramp, descending toward the rest area. It was a pickup truck, and as it pulled into the regular parking area, I could see two people inside. A man and woman who looked tired from a long journey. I wanted to run to them, to warn them, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish. The cold was seeping through my jacket and in my bones. I managed to raise my hand and wave, but they didn't seem to see me. The pickup's occupants got out and walked toward the restrooms, chatting quietly to each other, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "Funny," the woman said. "I don't remember seeing this place." The Voices Behind the Curtain, from Marcus Chen. The thing about long-haul trucking is that you learn to distinguish between all the different sounds your rig makes during those endless nights on the interstate. My Kenworth T680 has been my home for the better part of 6 years now, and I know every rattle, every hum, every mechanical whisper that comes from her engine. The steady rumble of the Cummins diesel becomes like a heartbeat after a while, something so familiar that you only notice it when it stops. But there are other sounds too, sounds that don't belong to the machinery, and those are the ones that can drive a man to the edge of sanity during the small hours when the world feels thin and strange. I was hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Denver, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of construction delays outside Flagstaff. The November night had settled, cold and clear across the high desert, with stars scattered like broken glass against the black sky. My CB radio crackled occasionally with the distant chatter of other drivers, but mostly it was just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt unwinding in my headlights. I had been driving for 11 hours straight, pushing the limits of my logbook, when fatigue finally forced me to pull into a rest area somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Colorado. The place was one of those forgotten truck stops that dot the interstate system like aging scars, the kind with flickering neon signs advertising diesel and coffee that tastes like motor oil. Only 3 other rigs were parked in the lot, their running lights creating small islands of amber and red in the darkness. I backed my trailer into a spot at the far end, away from the others, because I've always preferred my privacy during mandatory rest periods. The regulations require 10 hours of downtime, and I intended to spend most of it sleeping in my sleeper cabin. After completing my post-trip inspection and securing the load, I climbed into the back of my cab where I had set up my temporary living space. The sleeper cabin isn't large, maybe 7 feet long and 6 feet wide, but it contains everything a driver needs for life on the road. A narrow bunk stretches along one wall, with storage compartments above and below. A small television sits mounted in the corner, though reception is usually terrible in remote areas like this one. I had installed thick curtains around the entire sleeping area for privacy, heavy fabric that blocked out the lights from the truck stop and created a cocoon-like atmosphere. As I settled onto my bunk and pulled off my boots, I became aware of a sound that didn't belong to my truck's normal mechanical symphony. It was faint at first, barely audible above the idle of my engine and the distant hum of the truck stop's generators. A voice, or maybe voices, speaking in low tones that seemed to come from somewhere behind the curtained walls of my sleeper cabin. I paused, listening carefully, trying to determine if the sound was coming from one of the other trucks parked nearby. Sometimes voices can carry strange distances on quiet nights, bouncing off metal and concrete in ways that confuse the ear. But as I listened more intently, the voices seemed to be coming from directly behind my head, as if there were people standing just outside the thin aluminum wall of my cabin. The words were indistinct, muffled, and unclear, but there was an urgency to them that made the hair on my arms stand up. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, but the voices remained frustratingly incomprehensible, like conversations heard through water or thick glass. I convinced myself that it was probably just other drivers talking outside their rigs, perhaps doing their own inspections or taking a smoke break before settling in for the night. Sound travels in odd ways in the desert, I told myself, and the metal construction of truck trailers can create acoustic tricks that fool the mind. But when I peered through a gap in my curtains, I could see that the other trucks in the lot were dark and quiet, their drivers presumably already asleep in their own cabs. The voices continued, sometimes growing louder and more distinct, other times fading to barely audible whispers. There was something almost conversational about them, as if multiple people were engaged in some kind of discussion or debate. Occasionally, I thought I could make out a word or a phrase, but whenever I focused intently on trying to understand what was being said, the voices would become even more garbled and unclear. Sleep became impossible with this constant murmur surrounding my sleeping space. I tried adjusting my position on the bunk, thinking that perhaps the angle of my head was causing some kind of auditory illusion, but the voices followed me wherever I moved. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the very structure of my sleeper cabin had somehow become a conduit for these mysterious conversations. Around 2 in the morning, the voices began to change in character. What had started as indistinct murmuring gradually became more emotional, more urgent. I could hear what sounded like pleading, desperation creeping into the tone even though the words remained unintelligible. The sound reminded me of people trapped somewhere, calling for help, but calling from a place so distant that their voices could barely reach across the void. I decided to investigate outside my truck, thinking that perhaps there was some logical explanation I had missed. The November air bit at my skin as I climbed down from my cab, and the silence of the rest area was profound except for the idle hum of diesel engines and the distant hum of highway traffic. I walked slowly around my entire rig, checking for any possible source of the voices, but found nothing unusual. The other trucks remained dark and quiet, and there were no buildings or structures nearby that could account for what I was hearing. When I climbed back into my sleeper cabin, the voices were waiting for me, more distinct now than before. It was as if my brief absence had somehow strengthened their ability to penetrate the walls of my temporary home. I could hear at least 3 different speakers, maybe more, all talking at once in overlapping conversations that created a bewildering tapestry of sound. The emotional content was becoming more disturbing too, with what sounded like crying or sobbing mixed in with the urgent talking. As the night wore on, I found myself drawn into trying to decode these phantom conversations. I pressed my ear against different sections of the wall, mapping where the voices seemed strongest, looking for patterns in their rhythm and tone. The strangest thing was that they seemed to respond to my movements, becoming more active when I showed interest and fading slightly when I tried to ignore them. By 4 in the morning, exhaustion was making me question my own sanity. The voices had become so persistent and seemingly real that I began to wonder if somehow, impossibly, there actually were people trapped inside the walls of my sleeper cabin. I knew it was mechanically impossible, that the space between the inner and outer walls was barely wide enough for insulation, but the voices were so convincing that I found myself tapping on the walls, listening for any response. The response I got was immediate and terrifying. The moment my knuckles rapped against the aluminum paneling, all the voices stopped talking and began screaming. Not words, not conversation, but pure raw screams of terror and anguish that seemed to come from every direction at once. The sound was so loud and so close that I instinctively covered my ears and pressed myself against the opposite wall, as far from the source as I could get in the confined space. The screaming continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was even more unnerving than the voices had been. I sat on my bunk, heart pounding, afraid to move or make any sound that might trigger another episode. The normal sounds of my truck seemed muffled and distant now, as if the screaming had somehow changed the acoustic properties of my sleeping space. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting motionless on my bunk, afraid to sleep, afraid to move, afraid to do anything that might bring back those terrible screams. When the first hint of sunrise began to lighten the eastern horizon, visible through a small gap in my curtains, I immediately began preparing to leave. I had never been so grateful to see morning light, and I couldn't wait to put distance between myself and that rest area. As I conducted my pre-trip inspection in the growing daylight, everything about my truck appeared perfectly normal. The sleeper cabin looked exactly as it always had, with no signs of anything unusual or supernatural. In the bright morning sun, the previous night's experience began to feel like it might have been some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But as I pulled out of the rest area and merged back onto the interstate, I made a disturbing discovery. When I reached behind my seat to grab my thermos of coffee, my fingers brushed against the wall where the voices had been strongest during the night. The aluminum paneling felt warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been, even with the morning sun beginning to heat the cab, and when I pressed my ear against that same spot, I could swear I heard the faint echo of whispered conversations, so quiet now that they might have been my imagination, but still there, still waiting. The return mile. From Marcus? The interstate stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon under the pale October moon, and I'd been driving this same route for 15 years without incident, until that night, when everything I thought I knew about the road between Bakersfield and Phoenix decided to change. My Kenworth T880 hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, the engine's steady rhythm mixing with the soft whisper of wind across the cab, and I should have felt the usual comfort that comes with thousands of miles behind the wheel. But something felt different about this particular run, something that made me check my mirrors more often than usual and keep my speed a careful 5 under the limit. The radio crackled with the voices of other drivers, scattered across the desert highways, their conversations about weather and way stations and truck stop coffee, creating a loose network of companionship in the darkness. And I listened to them with half an ear while my eyes scanned the asphalt ahead for the telltale shapes that every long-haul driver learns to dread. Roadkill was a fact of life out here in the high desert where animals crossed without regard for human schedules or 18-wheel physics. And over the years, I had seen every kind of creature that called this wasteland home spread across the blacktop like grim mile markers. The first one appeared in my headlights around midnight, a coyote that had been struck recently enough that its fur still held the silvery sheen of life, and I slowed the rig and pulled into the left lane to give it respectful distance as I passed, the way my father had taught me when I was young and riding shotgun in his old Peterbilt. Something made me glance in the passenger mirror as the animal disappeared behind me, maybe just the ingrained habit of checking my trailer clearance, but what I saw there made me ease off the throttle and feel my pulse quicken in my throat like a bird trying to escape. The coyote was standing in the middle of the roadway, its body twisted at angles that should have been impossible for any living thing. Its head turned to watch my taillights recede into the distance with eyes that reflected red in the darkness. I told myself it was a trick of distance and mirror distortion, the way objects always looked strange in the convex glass. But my hands tightened on the steering wheel anyway, and I found myself pressing the accelerator a little harder than necessary, eager to put miles between myself and whatever I thought I'd seen. The CB radio continued its gentle chatter, but now the voices seemed more distant, as if the other drivers were speaking from some alternate version of the highway where the normal rules still applied. And I almost keyed the microphone to ask if anyone else had seen something unusual near mile marker 847, but something held me back. Perhaps the knowledge that what I'd witnessed couldn't be easily explained, or the fear that no one would answer at all. 20 miles further down the road, my headlights picked out another shape, this one larger and more angular. The broken form of what had once been a mule deer spread across the right shoulder like a dark stain against the pale concrete. The impact had been devastating, probably from one of the big rigs that ran this route regularly, and I felt the familiar mixture of sadness and resignation that came with these encounters, but I maintained my speed and lane position and tried not to think about the coyote that might or might not have been watching my departure with impossible eyes. But as I passed the deer, something caught my peripheral vision, a movement that was subtle enough that I might have dismissed it as wind ruffling the animal's coat, if I hadn't already seen one miracle of resurrection tonight. And when I checked my mirrors this time, I was almost ready for what I found there. The deer stood on legs that bent in ways that nature never intended, its neck twisted completely around so that its face pointed backward along the highway, and it began to follow my truck, with a gait that was neither walking nor running, but something else entirely, something that suggested movement without the usual relationship between intention and locomotion. My radio crackled and a voice I didn't recognize came through the speaker, low and distorted by static or distance or something else entirely, asking if anyone had seen the things that were gathering on the interstate tonight, the things that used to be dead but weren't anymore, and I reached for the microphone with a hand that trembled slightly before deciding that some questions were better left unanswered, and some conversations were better left unfinished. The miles ticked by on my odometer while I maintained a steady 70 miles per hour and tried to convince myself that the growing collection of shapes in my mirrors was nothing more than an optical illusion created by fatigue and the hypnotic rhythm of the road. But with each new piece of roadkill I passed, another impossible figure joined the procession, and soon I could see them strung out behind me like a parade of the broken and forgotten, all of them moving with that same unnatural gait, all of them keeping perfect pace with my truck despite their mangled limbs and twisted spines. A jackrabbit appeared next, then a hawk that must have misjudged its swoop and met the grill of some earlier traveler, then something that might have been a javelina or might have been something else entirely, and each one rose from the asphalt as I passed and fell into line with the others, creating a convoy of the impossible that stretched back into the darkness behind me like a funeral procession in reverse. The radio fell silent sometime around 2 in the morning, and the absence of human voices made the desert seem larger and more empty than before, as if the world had contracted to include only my truck and its impossible escort and the endless strip of highway that connected them. And I began to understand that whatever was happening tonight was bigger than a simple haunting or hallucination. Something that had been building for years along this stretch of road, fed by countless small tragedies and forgotten deaths, until it had reached some critical mass that allowed the impossible to become temporarily possible. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, enough to reach Phoenix without stopping, and I decided that stopping might not be wise anyway given the circumstances, though I couldn't have explained exactly what I feared might happen if I pulled into a truck stop with my ghostly entourage still maintaining formation behind me. The thought of other drivers seeing what I was seeing, or worse, not seeing it at all, filled me with a dread that went deeper than simple embarrassment or concern for my reputation. As dawn began to hint at the horizon with the faintest suggestion of gray light, I noticed that my followers were becoming more transparent, their forms growing thin and wavering like heat mirages, and I allowed myself to hope that sunrise might bring an end to this strange episode and restore the familiar rationality of daylight driving. But even as they faded, I could sense their presence, a weight of attention and purpose that pressed against the back of my truck like a gentle but insistent hand. The last of them disappeared just as I reached the Phoenix city limits, dissolving into the morning like frost under sunlight, and I completed my delivery and logged the trip in my book and never mentioned what I'd seen to anyone, though I found myself taking different routes for months afterward, avoiding that particular stretch of highway whenever possible. But sometimes, when I'm driving other roads in other states, I'll pass a piece of fresh roadkill and find myself checking my mirrors with unusual care, watching for the moment when death might decide to stretch its limbs and follow me into whatever lies beyond the next bend in the road. And I'll remember that night when the desert showed me that some journeys never really end. They just change direction and find new travelers to guide through the darkness between what was and what might yet be. The Rhythm of the Dead. From Marcus. The CB radio crackled with static as I pulled into the truck stop outside of Bakersfield, the amber glow of sodium lights cutting through the thick California fog that had been my companion for the last 60 miles. My Peterbilt's diesel engine rumbled to a stop with that familiar shudder that comes after 8 hours of steady highway driving, and I could feel the weight of exhaustion settling into my shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:37 in the morning, and the world outside my cab felt as hollow and empty as a discarded shell. I'd been running freight from Seattle to San Diego for the better part of 15 years, and in all that time, I'd learned to read the night like other men read newspapers. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my forearm stand at attention, despite the warmth radiating from my engine. The fog moved in strange patterns around the parking lot, swirling and eddying as if guided by invisible hands, and the usual chorus of idling engines seemed muted, distant, like sounds heard through water. The truck stop itself looked tired, its neon signs flickering with that irregular pulse that suggested failing transformers and deferred maintenance. A few other big rigs sat scattered across the lot like sleeping giants, their chrome bumpers catching and reflecting the sickly yellow light in fragments. I was reaching for my logbook when I noticed her standing by the fuel pumps, a slight figure in a pale blue dress that seemed to move independently of any wind I could feel. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders, and she held herself with the particular stillness of someone who'd been waiting a very long time. When she saw me looking, she raised one hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part plea, and began walking toward my truck with steps that seemed to make no sound against the wet asphalt. There was something about the way she moved that reminded me of smoke, fluid and insubstantial, as if the fog itself had taken human form. I rolled down my window as she approached, and the night air that drifted in carried scents of diesel fuel and rain-soaked earth. But underneath those familiar smells was something else, something that made me think of old churches and forgotten graveyards. She stopped just outside my door, tilting her head up to look at me, with eyes that appeared almost colorless in the artificial light. And when she spoke, her voice had the soft, measured cadence of someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "I need a ride," she said, and the words seemed to hang in the air between us longer than they should have, as if the night itself was reluctant to let them go. "Just to the next town over. I can pay." She held up a small cloth purse, the kind my grandmother might have carried, and I noticed that her fingers were perfectly still, no tremor of cold or nervousness despite the chill that was beginning to seep through my jacket. In 15 years of long-haul driving, I'd picked up exactly 3 hitchhikers, and each time I'd regretted it before we'd gone 10 miles. Company policy was clear about passengers, and my insurance wouldn't cover anyone who wasn't family or documented crew, but there was something in her expression, a quality of desperate patience that reminded me of my sister waiting by hospital windows during our mother's final weeks, that made the word "no" stick in my throat like a bone. "Where you headed?" I heard myself asking, and she smiled for the first time, an expression that didn't quite reach those pale eyes but transformed her face into something almost luminous in the uncertain light. "Tehachapi," she said, naming a small mountain town about 40 miles south on my route. "I have family there. They're expecting me." She paused, and I could hear the distant hum of the interstate, endless and hypnotic. I've been traveling for so long now, so very long. I should have asked her how she'd gotten stranded, should have suggested she call someone or wait for morning when the bus would run. Should have done any of a dozen things that would have kept her on the ground and me alone in my cab. Instead, I found myself reaching across to unlock the passenger door, the mechanism clicking with unnatural loudness in the fog-muffled quiet. She climbed up into the cab with surprising grace, settling into the passenger seat as if she'd been riding in long-haul trucks her entire life. Up close, I could see that her dress was well made but old-fashioned, with small pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar, the kind of thing that might have been stylish 30 years ago. She folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead through the windshield, and I noticed that the glass didn't fog with her breath, despite the temperature difference between the outside air and the warmth of the cab. I engaged the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the familiar routine of checking mirrors and adjusting speed helping to settle the strange nervousness that had been building in my chest. The fog seemed to thicken as we drove, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards in any direction, forcing me to slow to 45 miles per hour and keep my attention focused on the broken white line that served as our only guide through the gray-white void. For the first 10 miles, she said nothing, and I found myself becoming hyper-aware of her presence in ways that didn't make sense. She sat perfectly upright, never shifting position or reaching to adjust the air vents, never making the small, unconscious movements that passengers usually make during a long ride. Her breathing, if she was breathing at all, was completely inaudible over the steady rumble of the diesel engine, and when I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her reflection seemed strangely faded, as if seen through layers of old glass. "You drive this route often?" she asked eventually, her voice cutting through the engine noise with startling clarity, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without knowing why. 3 times a week for the past 15 years, I replied, grateful for something normal to talk about. No, every truck stop, every way station, every speed trap from Seattle to the Mexican border. I adjusted the heater, trying to dispel the chill that seemed to be radiating from the passenger side of the cab. "What about you? You from Tehachapi originally?" She turned to look at me for the first time since we'd started driving, and I was struck by how her skin seemed to have an almost translucent quality, as if lit from within by some pale, cold light. "I lived there once," she said, and something in her tone suggested that once might have been a very long time ago. "Before I started traveling, before I got lost." The fog was growing thicker now, pressing against the windshield like cotton batting, and I had to lean forward to make out the road markers. The mile posts seemed to be passing more slowly than they should have, as if distance itself was becoming elastic in the gray-white void that surrounded us. I checked the speedometer twice, but it showed a steady 45 miles per hour, the same speed I'd been maintaining since we left the truck stop. "It's strange," she continued, her voice taking on a dreamy, distant quality that seemed to blend with the hypnotic rhythm of the engine. "How roads can change. How a path that once led home can suddenly lead somewhere else entirely. Time isn't the same when you're traveling. Minutes can feel like hours, and hours can pass like heartbeats." I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard and felt a jolt of confusion. According to the display, we'd been driving for over an hour, but the mile markers suggested we'd covered perhaps 20 miles. The mathematics didn't work, and when I tried to calculate our speed based on elapsed time and distance traveled, the numbers refused to make sense. The fog seemed to be playing tricks with perspective, making familiar landmarks appear in the wrong places, or not at all. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked, partly because she'd grown very still and partly because I was beginning to feel lightheaded myself, as if the air in the cab was gradually becoming too thin to breathe properly. She didn't answer immediately, and when I looked at her more closely, I noticed that her chest wasn't moving, with the regular rise and fall of respiration. Her hands, still folded neatly in her lap, had taken on a waxy, artificial appearance, like those of a department store mannequin, and her skin seemed to be growing more translucent with each passing mile. "I haven't felt anything for a very long time," she said finally, and her voice now had an echo to it, as if spoken from the bottom of a deep well. "Not since the accident. Not since the night I was supposed to come home." The temperature in the cab dropped suddenly, dramatically, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The heater was running full blast, but it seemed to have no effect against the cold that was radiating out from the passenger seat like waves from a stone dropped in still water. I reached for the CB radio to call for... The ice in their veins. From Marcus. The diesel started to gel around 2 in the morning, somewhere between Fairbanks and nowhere. I'd been driving these northern routes for 15 years, hauling everything from construction equipment to medical supplies across Alaska's frozen arteries. But I'd never felt cold like this. It wasn't just the -40 outside, or the way my breath fogged even inside the heated cab of my Kenworth. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to seep through steel and glass and settle deep in my bones. The temperature gauge had been dropping steadily for the past hour, despite the engine running hot as always. My fuel tank heaters were working overtime, but I could feel the truck struggling, the engine coughing as thick diesel fought its way through lines that should have been flowing smooth as water. The CB radio crackled with static, other drivers reporting similar problems up and down the Dalton Highway, but their voices seemed distant and hollow, as if they were calling from the bottom of a frozen well. I'd pulled into a rest stop designated on my GPS, though calling it a rest stop was generous. It was little more than a wide patch of gravel beside the road, marked by a single flickering streetlight that cast everything in sickly yellow pools of illumination. 3 other trucks were already there, their running lights dim pinpricks in the overwhelming darkness of the Alaskan night. I could see their exhaust stacks pumping white clouds into the air, but something about the scene felt wrong, like a photograph that had been left out in the cold too long. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on snow that felt harder than concrete, and made my way toward the fuel island. The pump looked ancient, its digital display flickering between numbers that didn't quite make sense, and when I lifted the nozzle, the metal was so cold it burned through my insulated gloves. The diesel that came out was thick as syrup, with an oily rainbow sheen that seemed to move independently of the liquid itself. As I filled my tank, I became aware of the other drivers. They stood beside their rigs like sentries, perfectly still despite the brutal cold. I called out a greeting, as is customary among us road warriors, but none of them responded. When I looked closer, I could see their faces in the dim light, and my breath caught in my throat. Their eyes were wrong, completely wrong, like looking into empty sockets that had been filled with black ice. The fuel pump clicked off with a sound like breaking glass, and I hung up the nozzle with hands that had begun to shake, though I told myself it was just the cold. One of the other drivers turned toward me then, his movements mechanical and deliberate, and I could see that his eyes weren't just dark, they were hollow, as if someone had taken an ice cream scoop and removed everything that made him human. When he spoke, his voice was the sound of wind through frozen pipes. "Cold night for driving," he said, though his lips barely moved, and frost gathered on his words as they left his mouth. "Fuel's getting thick. Hard to keep moving when everything wants to freeze solid." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and started backing toward my truck. But the other drivers were moving now too, all of them turning in my direction with that same mechanical precision. Their hollow eyes reflected the streetlight like black mirrors, and I realized that the cold I'd been feeling wasn't coming from the weather at all. It was radiating from them, from whatever they had become in this God-forsaken place. My hands fumbled with the door handle of my Kenworth, the metal so cold it stuck to my skin even through the gloves. Behind me, I could hear the crunch of boots on frozen gravel, slow and measured, as the hollow-eyed drivers began to close the distance. The engine turned over reluctantly, the diesel still fighting against the unnatural cold, but it caught on the third try, and I threw the truck into gear without bothering to let it warm up properly. As I pulled away from that cursed fuel stop, I glanced in my side mirrors and saw them standing there in the fading light, perfectly still once again, watching my retreat with those empty sockets that had once held human eyes. The fuel gauge read full, but the diesel I'd pumped felt wrong in my tank, heavier than it should be, as if it carried some of that frozen darkness with it. For the next 2 hours, I drove through a landscape that seemed increasingly alien, past snow-covered trees that looked more like the bones of ancient creatures, past frozen lakes that reflected nothing despite the clear sky above. The truck ran well enough, but I could feel that wrongness in every mile, as if the fuel I'd taken was slowly changing something fundamental about the vehicle itself. It was near dawn when I finally reached the next truck stop, a legitimate one with bright lights and a warm diner attached. I pulled up to the pumps and sat there for a long moment, watching normal people move around in the early morning light, drinking coffee and checking their load straps and doing all the ordinary things that suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. When I climbed down from the cab, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. The cold was gone, the terrible supernatural chill that had followed me from that rest area, but something else remained. I walked around to check my fuel tank, and what I saw there made my blood run cold all over again. Ice had formed around the fuel cap and down the side of the tank, but not ordinary ice. This was black as obsidian and formed in patterns that hurt to look at directly, like frozen fractals that implied geometries that shouldn't exist in our world. When I touched it with a screwdriver from my toolkit, it didn't chip away like normal ice. Instead, it seemed to absorb the metal, leaving the screwdriver pitted and discolored. I spent the next hour trying to remove that ice, using hot water from the diner and a hairdryer borrowed from the truck stop's maintenance shop. Most of it finally came off, steaming away into vapor that smelled of sulfur and old batteries. But I could still see traces of it in the metal itself, dark veins that ran along the tank like frozen blood vessels. The mechanic on duty took a look at my fuel system and shook his head, his face grave beneath his oil-stained cap. He said the diesel in my tank was unlike anything he'd ever seen, thick and dark, and shot through with what looked like threads of solid ice that refused to melt even under direct heat. He recommended draining the entire system and flushing it with clean fuel, but when we tried, the contaminated diesel that came out moved like it was alive, pooling on the shop floor in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when we weren't looking directly at them. I left that truck stop with a full tank of clean fuel and a receipt that showed everything was normal, but I knew it wasn't over. For the rest of that run, and for days afterward, I could feel something riding with me in the cab, something cold and patient, that whispered in the sound of the engine and watched me through reflections in the side mirrors. My eyes began to ache, a deep, persistent pain that started behind my pupils and worked its way back into my skull. Even now, months later, I can still feel it sometimes, especially on cold nights when the fuel runs thick and the road ahead disappears into darkness. I've started avoiding those northern routes, sticking to warmer climates where diesel flows like water and truck stops are bright islands of humanity in the night. But sometimes, when I'm filling up at an unfamiliar pump, I catch sight of another driver in my peripheral vision, someone standing perfectly still beside their rig, and I wonder if their eyes are still their own. The worst part is the uncertainty, the not knowing if what I experienced that night was real or just some kind of hypothermic hallucination brought on by extreme cold and too many hours behind the wheel. But then I remember the receipt in my wallet, the one from that cursed fuel stop that shouldn't exist, and I pull it out to look at the address. The paper is always blank now, white as fresh snow, but sometimes I can still feel the raised impressions of letters that were never really there, spelling out words in a language that sounds like wind through frozen bones. The Devil's Frequency. From Jake Morrison. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours, which wasn't unusual on a night like this. Heavy rain drummed against my windshield as I navigated the winding mountain roads of eastern Kentucky, my 18-wheeler loaded down with auto parts bound for Nashville. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, their rhythmic thrum mixing with the steady hum of the diesel engine beneath my feet. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, and nights like this were just part of the job. Long, lonely stretches where the only company came through the radio waves. I reached for the CB handset, checking if anyone else was riding the storm out there in the darkness. Channel 19 was quiet, except for the occasional burst of static, so I started scanning through the other frequencies, looking for a friendly voice to help pass the miles. Most channels offered nothing but white noise, but as I clicked past channel 6, I caught a fragment of conversation. The voice was distant, distorted by atmospheric interference, but distinctly human. Eastbound on the mountain road, about mile marker 47. The signal faded in and out, but it was clear enough that I recognized the location. I was approaching mile marker 45 myself, which meant another trucker was just ahead of me in this weather. Company would be welcome on a night like this. I keyed the microphone. "This is Iron Horse, eastbound on Kentucky Route 60. Approaching mile 47. You got your ears on, driver?" I waited, listening to the soft hiss of static. The rain seemed to intensify, forcing me to lean forward and peer through the windshield as my headlights carved thin tunnels through the darkness ahead. The response came through clearer than I'd expected, though something about the voice made me uneasy. It was calm, measured, but carried an odd, hollow quality that didn't quite sound right through the speaker. "Iron Horse, this is Knight Rider. Good to have some company out here in the soup. You making good time?" "About as good as can be expected in this weather," I replied, glancing at my speedometer. I was doing maybe 45 in a 55 zone, playing it safe on the slick asphalt. "You running heavy tonight?" "Heavy as sin," came the response, followed by a sound that might have been laughter but distorted through the radio static. "Been carrying this load for longer than I care to remember. What's your 20 now, Iron Horse?" I checked the upcoming mile marker illuminated by my headlights. "Just passing 48. Should be coming up on you any minute now." I strained to see ahead through the rain, looking for the familiar glow of taillights, but the road stretched empty before me. The mountains rose on either side like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in the low-hanging clouds. "Funny thing about these mountain roads," Knight Rider's voice crackled through the speaker. "Sometimes they play tricks on a man's mind. Sometimes you think you're going one direction when you're really going another." There was something unsettling in his tone now, a subtle shift that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. "Come again, Knight Rider?" I keyed the mic, but only static answered me. I tried again. "Knight Rider, you still out there?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the rain and the steady rumble of my engine. I switched back to channel 19, tried a few others, but the airwaves had gone dead. Even the ambient static seemed muted now, as if the storm had swallowed all the radio signals in the area. That's when I noticed the mile markers. I'd been watching for 49, but instead, the sign that emerged from the darkness read mile 46. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread it in the rain, but there was no mistake. Somehow I'd lost ground instead of gaining it. The road must have curved back on itself, one of those switchback sections that winds through the mountains. Still, I could have sworn this stretch was straighter than that. I reached for the CB again and happened to click past channel 6. Knight Rider's voice came through immediately, as clear as if he were sitting in the cab next to me. "Iron Horse, you still looking for me out there in the dark?" "Knight Rider, what's your 20? I think I might have missed you somehow." I kept my voice steady, professional, but something cold had settled in my stomach. The dashboard lights cast an eerie green glow across the interior of my cab, and shadows seemed to shift in ways that didn't quite match the movement of the wipers. "Oh, you didn't miss me," Knight Rider replied, and now I was certain there was something wrong with his voice. It carried too much weight, too much resonance, like an echo from the bottom of a deep well. "I'm right where I've always been. Question is, where are you?" The mile marker that passed by my window read 44. I was definitely losing ground now, moving backwards somehow despite maintaining steady speed in the proper direction. The rain seemed to be falling sideways now, creating strange patterns on the windshield that looked almost like faces in peripheral vision. I checked my compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. "Knight Rider, I'm having some equipment problems here. My GPS is acting up, compass is spinning. You familiar with this stretch of road?" I tried to keep the growing unease out of my voice, but my hands were starting to sweat despite the coolness of the night air. "I'm very familiar with this road," Knight Rider answered. "Been traveling it for quite some time now. It's a special road, Iron Horse. Not everyone gets to experience it. Consider yourself fortunate." The words were followed by that distorted sound again. Definitely laughter now. But wrong somehow, like it was being played backward through the speaker. I grabbed my cell phone, hoping to call dispatch or even just to get a GPS signal, but the screen showed no service. Not unusual in these mountains, but the timing felt ominous. Mile marker 42 drifted past, then 40, then 38. I was definitely moving backward through space despite traveling forward in time, and the impossibility of it made my chest tight with panic. "What do you want?" I asked into the microphone, abandoning any pretense of normal trucker conversation. The question hung in the air for a long moment, accompanied only by the sound of rain and the increasingly labored breathing of my own lungs. "Want?" Knight Rider's voice seemed to come from everywhere now, not just the radio speaker, but from the very air around me. "I don't want anything, Iron Horse, but this road, this frequency, it has its own needs. It gets lonely out here in the mountains. Sometimes it likes to have visitors. Sometimes it likes to keep them." The temperature in the cab began to drop noticeably, my breath starting to mist despite the heater running full blast. Frost began forming on the inside edges of the windshield, creating crystalline patterns that definitely looked like reaching fingers now. Mile marker 35 appeared and vanished. Then 33, 29, 26. I was accelerating backward through space at an impossible rate. I tried switching off the CB radio entirely, but Knight Rider's voice continued emanating from the speaker. "You can't turn off a frequency that exists outside normal channels, Iron Horse. This is channel infinity, channel forever, channel nowhere. Welcome to the CB from hell." My engine began to sputter despite the fuel gauge showing 3/4 full. The headlights dimmed and flickered, casting weird shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Through the windshield, I began to see lights that couldn't possibly be there. Other trucks, dozens of them, all traveling the same impossible backward journey through space and time. Their shapes were wrong somehow, too tall, too angular, with lights arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. You see them now, don't you? Knight Rider's voice had taken on an almost gentle quality, like a tour guide explaining points of interest. All the other drivers who've found their way to this frequency over the years. They're still here, still traveling, still trying to reach their destinations. The road provides everything we need: fuel, food, purpose. We're never lonely here. Mile marker 15 flashed by, then 10, then 5. I realized with mounting horror that I was approaching mile marker 0, and something told me that's where the road would end, or begin, depending on perspective. Beyond that point lay something I couldn't imagine, and didn't want to discover. In desperation, I grabbed the CB handset and began cycling rapidly through channels, calling out on each one. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Iron Horse on Kentucky Route 60, requesting immediate assistance. Anyone out there, please respond." But every channel carried only Knight Rider's laughter now, that impossible backward sound that seemed to originate from somewhere outside of normal space. Then, on channel 13, I heard something different, a faint voice, definitely human, definitely normal. "Iron Horse, this is..." The package that found its way. From Marcus Holloway. The GPS on my dashboard flickered between two different addresses as I rolled through the industrial district at 11:30 on that rain-soaked Thursday night. My 18-wheeler groaned under the weight of what my manifest claimed was furniture, though the sealed trailer behind me had been making the oddest settling sounds since I'd picked it up from that warehouse outside Toledo. The rhythmic thrum of my diesel engine mixed with the steady percussion of raindrops against my windshield, creating a hypnotic symphony that had kept me company for the last 400 miles. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, and in all that time, I'd never had a delivery quite like this one. The paperwork was pristine, almost too clean, with crisp edges and ink that seemed to shimmer under my cab's dome light. The recipient was listed simply as Whitmore Residence, with an address on Sycamore Lane in a town called Millbrook Falls, a place so small it barely registered as a dot on my atlas. What struck me as peculiar was the delivery time specification, between midnight and 3 a.m. only. Most residential deliveries happen during daylight hours, but the payment was generous enough to silence any questions I might have had. The rain intensified as I navigated through Millbrook Falls' empty main street, my headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating storefronts that looked frozen in time. The town felt like something from a Norman Rockwell painting left out in the rain too long, all faded charm and weathered edges. My truck's engine echoed off the sleeping buildings, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed too loud for the hushed atmosphere. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light that my trailer passed through like a slow-moving shadow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from behind darkened windows. Sycamore Lane turned out to be a narrow residential street, lined with Victorian houses, their Gothic silhouettes crowned with elaborate gables and wraparound porches. Ancient oak trees formed a canopy overhead, their branches reaching across the street like arthritic fingers attempting to touch. The address I was seeking, 1247, should have been halfway down the block according to my calculations, but as I crept forward in low gear, my headlights revealed something that made my blood run cold. Every house on the street was dark, not just sleeping dark, but abandoned dark, with boarded windows and yards choked with weeds that glistened wetly in the rain. I pulled to a stop in front of what should have been 1247 and killed the engine, though I left my running lights on. The sudden silence felt oppressive, broken only by the rain drumming against my cab and the occasional tick of cooling metal. According to my paperwork, I was supposed to deliver 3 large crates to the front porch, but the house before me was clearly vacant, paint peeled from its siding in long strips, and several shutters hung at precarious angles. The condemned notice was barely visible through the grime on what had once been a front window. I reached for my radio to contact dispatch, but static filled the channel where their frequency should have been. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't entirely unusual in rural areas, but something about the complete communication blackout made my skin crawl. The rain seemed to be getting heavier, turning my windshield into a streaming canvas of distorted light and shadow. I sat there for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to decide my next move. That's when I noticed the porch light at 1247 was on. If it hadn't been illuminated when I'd first stopped, I was certain of that. The warm yellow glow seemed to pulse gently, as if powered by something other than the electrical grid that surely no longer served this abandoned street. As I stared, transfixed, I could swear I saw movement behind the front door's glass panels, shadows shifting in a way that suggested someone was inside, waiting. My hands trembled slightly as I retrieved my flashlight and clipboard from the passenger seat. The delivery instructions were specific. Place crates on front porch, ring doorbell once, return to truck, and wait for recipient acknowledgement before leaving. It seemed absurd to follow these directions when delivering to what was obviously an empty house, but I'd been in this business long enough to know that some clients had very particular requirements, and deviation from protocol could cost me the job. I stepped down from my cab into the rain, immediately feeling the cold water seep through my jacket. The street was eerily quiet except for the sound of precipitation hitting pavement and the distant rumble of my truck's engine block cooling. My boots splashed through puddles as I made my way to the trailer's rear doors, the beam from my flashlight dancing across the wet asphalt. When I unlocked and opened the trailer, the smell that wafted out was unlike anything I had encountered in 15 years of hauling freight. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was definitely organic, like dried flowers mixed with something metallic and old. The 3 crates were exactly where they should have been, secured with strapping and marked with handling instructions in that same shimmering ink I'd noticed on the paperwork. Each crate was roughly the size of a coffin, though considerably wider, and despite their substantial appearance, they were surprisingly light when I loaded them onto my dolly. The path to the house was cracked and uneven, with grass growing through the spaces between flagstones. My flashlight beam revealed a front porch that, unlike the rest of the property, seemed to be in perfect repair. The boards looked newly painted, and the columns supporting the roof showed no signs of the decay that characterized the rest of the structure. As I wheeled the first crate up the porch steps, I could hear music playing softly from somewhere inside the house, a melody that sounded like a lullaby, but in a language I couldn't identify. By the time I had all 3 crates positioned according to the delivery instructions, the porch light had grown noticeably brighter, casting everything in a warm, golden radiance that seemed to push back the rain itself. I consulted my clipboard one final time, then pressed the doorbell button beside the front entrance. The chime that sounded from within was deep and resonant, like church bells heard from a great distance. The music stopped immediately. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, rain dripping from my jacket onto the porch floor, waiting for some sign of acknowledgement from inside. The silence stretched on, until I began to wonder if I should ring again. But then I heard footsteps approaching the door. They were slow and deliberate, the sound of someone taking their time, and with each step, the porch light grew a little brighter. The footsteps stopped directly on the other side of the door. I waited, clipboard clutched in my increasingly damp hands, but no one opened the door or called out a greeting. I could sense a presence just beyond the wooden barrier, could almost feel eyes studying me through the panels of frosted glass. The rain continued to fall around the porch's perimeter, but somehow none of it seemed to be touching me anymore, as if the golden light was creating a protective bubble. "Delivery for Wetmore," I called out, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the weird acoustics of that covered porch. The response came not as words, but as a sound I still struggled to describe, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into my bones. The crates began to emit the same humming sound, a harmonic that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly around the edges. I took an instinctive step backward, bumping into the middle crate and nearly losing my balance. That's when the lid of the first crate began to move. It wasn't opening exactly, but rather shifting, as if something inside was trying to adjust its position. The humming grew louder, and I could see that all 3 crates were now vibrating slightly, their wooden sides creaking with internal pressure. Whatever was inside these containers, it definitely wasn't furniture, and it was definitely alive. I backed toward the porch steps, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as my hands shook. The front door remained closed, but the presence behind it felt stronger now, more immediate, as if whatever was in there was pressing itself against the glass panels. The porch light continued to brighten until it was almost painful to look at directly, and the golden radiance began to take on an otherworldly quality that reminded me of pictures I'd seen of the aurora borealis. The second crate's lid shifted with a grinding sound that cut through the humming like fingernails on a chalkboard. I could see gaps appearing between the lid and the sides, dark spaces that seemed to absorb the golden light rather than reflect it. Something that might have been fingers, though far too long and pale to be human, briefly appeared through one of these gaps before withdrawing back into the darkness within. I turned and ran. My boots slipped on the wet flagstones as I sprinted toward my truck, and I could hear the crates behind me continuing their otherworldly song. The sound followed me down the path, and "The Trailer That Breathes," from Jake Morrison. The CB radio crackled to life just past midnight on Interstate 80, somewhere between the neon wasteland of Reno and the endless stretch toward Salt Lake City. Static filled my cab for a moment before a dispatcher's voice cut through, professional but tired. "We got a special pickup for you, Morrison. Emergency freight needs to reach Denver by Tuesday morning." I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel of my Peterbilt 379, the familiar rumble of the Caterpillar engine beneath me like a mechanical heartbeat that had kept me company for nearly 2 decades on these lonely highways. The pickup location was unusual, 40 miles off the main interstate, down a series of increasingly narrow state roads that seemed to lead nowhere. My headlights carved through the Nevada darkness, illuminating sagebrush and the occasional reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature. The GPS on my dashboard struggled to maintain signal, flickering between satellite connections as I descended into what felt like a pocket of forgotten America. When I finally reached the coordinates, I found myself at a truck stop that looked like it had been abandoned for years, though a single overhead light buzzed and flickered above a loading dock where a refrigerated trailer sat waiting. The facility appeared deserted except for a lone figure in coveralls who emerged from a small office building as I backed my rig into position. He moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who had worked night shifts for too many years, his face shadowed beneath a baseball cap. "You Morrison?" he asked, and when I nodded, he handed me a clipboard with paperwork that seemed unnecessarily complicated for what the manifest described as biological research materials. The temperature requirement was specific 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and he emphasized multiple times that the refrigeration unit must not be tampered with or turned off under any circumstances. As we connected the trailer to my truck, I noticed something odd about the refrigeration unit. Instead of the steady mechanical hum I was accustomed to from countless refrigerated loads, this one seemed to pulse with an irregular rhythm, almost like breathing. The sound would grow slightly louder, then softer, in a pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of someone sleeping. I mentioned this to the loading dock worker, but he just shrugged and muttered something about new models having different compressor cycles. He seemed eager to see me gone, practically shoving the bills of lading into my hands and waving me toward the exit before I had finished my standard pre-trip inspection. The first few hours of the journey passed without incident as I climbed back toward the interstate through winding mountain roads. Rain began to fall as I reached higher elevations, droplets streaming across my windshield in patterns that caught and scattered the glow from my dashboard instruments. The wipers moved in steady rhythm, creating a hypnotic counterpoint to the unusual breathing sound coming from behind me. I tried to focus on the familiar comfort of the road, the way the truck responded to my touch, the distant voices on the CB sharing weather reports and traffic conditions. But increasingly, my attention was drawn to that strange respiratory rhythm emanating from my trailer. By 3 a.m, I had convinced myself that something was definitely wrong with the refrigeration system. The breathing sound had grown more pronounced, and occasionally I could swear I heard other noises mixed in with it. Soft sounds that might have been settling cargo, or might have been something else entirely. During a fuel stop in a small Colorado town, I decided to take a look at the trailer myself. The loading dock workers' warnings about not tampering with the refrigeration unit echoed in my mind, but my responsibility as a driver included ensuring the safety and integrity of my load. The trailer's exterior looked normal enough in the harsh fluorescent glare of the truck stop's lights. Standard white refrigerated unit, proper DOT markings, nothing unusual about the manufacturer's plates or inspection stickers. But as I walked around to the back doors, the breathing sound became unmistakable. It was coming from inside the trailer, rhythmic and deep, like something large and alive drawing air into capacious lungs. I pressed my ear against the cold metal doors and immediately pulled back, startled by what felt like warmth radiating from inside, despite the frigid external temperature of the refrigeration system. The lock on the trailer doors was a simple padlock, and though I knew I was violating protocol, I felt compelled to look inside. The manifest had been vague about the contents, listing only research materials and some numerical codes that meant nothing to me. As a professional driver, I had learned to respect the privacy of my loads, but something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. The breathing sound seemed to respond to my presence, growing slightly faster as I fumbled with the lock, as if whatever was inside could sense my proximity. When the doors finally swung open, I was hit by a wave of warm, humid air that carried an organic scent unlike anything I had encountered in 20 years of hauling everything from livestock to medical supplies. The interior of the trailer was dimly lit by the small courtesy lights, but I could see that instead of the usual cargo arrangements, the space was filled with what looked like a massive, pale membrane stretched from floor to ceiling. The surface was translucent and seemed to pulse with that same breathing rhythm I had been hearing, expanding and contracting as if the entire trailer had become some kind of enormous lung. Veins or channels of darker tissue ran through the membrane like a circulatory system, carrying what might have been fluid or might have been something else entirely. The walls of the trailer seemed to have been modified, with tubes and connections that suggested this organic structure was somehow integrated with the refrigeration system. As I stared in horrified fascination, I realized that the breathing was not just the sound of air moving through the membrane, but the actual respiratory function of something alive, something that had grown to fill the entire cargo space. The membrane suddenly bulged toward me, as if responding to my presence, and I stumbled backward just as something that might have been an eye opened in its surface. The organ was enormous, easily 3 feet across, with an iris that seemed to shift between colors I could not quite identify. It focused on me with unmistakable intelligence, and in that moment of recognition the breathing rhythm changed to something that sounded almost excited, as if this creature had been waiting for someone to discover it. I slammed the trailer door shut and ran back to my cab, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The CB radio was filled with chatter, normal truckers discussing mundane things like delivery schedules and weather patterns, but their voices seemed to come from another world entirely. Behind me, the breathing had become more agitated, accompanied by new sounds that might have been communication attempts or might have been something far worse. The trailer began to rock slightly on its suspension, subtle movements that suggested the creature inside was becoming more active. As I pulled back onto the highway, I tried to convince myself that I could simply complete the delivery and walk away from whatever I had witnessed. The paperwork indicated a research facility outside Denver, and perhaps whatever was in my trailer was some kind of legitimate scientific experiment. But the memory of that enormous eye, the intelligence I had seen there, and the way the creature had seemed to recognize me as more than just another piece of equipment made it impossible to rationalize what was happening. The remaining hours to Denver passed in a blur of mounting anxiety and increasingly erratic behavior from my cargo. The breathing rhythm would sometimes accelerate to an almost frantic pace, then slow to barely perceptible whispers that were somehow even more unsettling. Occasionally, I would hear what sounded like attempts at vocalization, low sounds that seemed to be testing the acoustic properties of human speech. The trailer continued to rock gently, and I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see the doors burst open and that membrane come flooding out onto the highway. When I finally reached the delivery address, I found that the research facility was nothing more than another abandoned loading dock, this one in an industrial area that looked like it had been vacant for years. But there were people waiting for me, figures in dark clothing who moved with the same deliberate efficiency as the loader back in Nevada. They seemed unsurprised by my obviously shaken condition and quickly took possession of the trailer, unhooking it from my truck with practiced speed, while carefully maintaining the refrigeration connection to a portable power unit. As I prepared to leave, one of the figures approached my cab and handed me an envelope containing my payment, along with a standard release form that seemed to have far too many legal disclaimers about confidentiality and non-disclosure. "The client was very satisfied with your service," he said, in a voice that suggested this was not his first involvement with unusual cargo. "There may be other opportunities for a driver who can handle special deliveries without asking too many questions." I drove away from that facility with more questions than answers, but one thing had become terrifyingly clear. Somewhere in the network of highways and truck stops, that form the circulatory system of American commerce, there are things being transported that exist far outside the boundaries of normal freight. The trailer that breathes was not an isolated incident, but part of something larger, something that uses the trucking industry as its delivery system for purposes I can barely comprehend. Even now, weeks later, I find myself listening to every refrigerated trailer I pass on the highway, checking for that telltale breathing rhythm that would indicate when red lights don't mean stop. From Marcus. The fog rolled in like a living thing that October night, thick and predatory, swallowing the interstate whole somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno. I'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling everything from electronics to produce up and down California's Central Valley, and I knew every mile marker, every off-ramp, every truck stop like the back of my weathered hands. But that night the world had become alien, reduced to nothing but the amber glow of my headlights pushing weakly through the gray wall that pressed against my windshield. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, a comforting rumble that vibrated through the cab and up into my bones. The heater was running on low, just enough to keep the windows from fogging up on the inside, and the CB crackled occasionally with the distant voices of other drivers warning about the conditions ahead. Visibility had dropped to maybe 30 feet, if I was being generous. The smart thing would have been to pull over at the next truck stop and wait it out, but I had a delivery deadline in Sacramento, and the produce in my trailer wouldn't stay fresh much longer. That's when I first saw them, those red lights piercing through the fog like crimson eyes. Brake lights, or so I thought, glowing steady and bright about a quarter-mile ahead. I eased off the throttle and let my rig slow down naturally, the engine brake helping to control our descent down what I knew was a gentle grade. The lights seemed to be moving at a decent clip, maybe 50 miles per hour, which was reasonable for these conditions. I settled in behind them, grateful to have something to follow, someone else to help navigate through this gray maze. The radio in my cab played softly, some late-night talk show about unexplained phenomena, the host's voice smooth and hypnotic as he discussed listeners' encounters with things that couldn't quite be explained. I normally didn't pay much attention to such programs, but the fog and the isolation made even the most ridiculous stories seem plausible. The host was describing a trucker's account of phantom vehicles seen on lonely highways, and I found myself listening more intently than usual, my eyes fixed on those steady red lights ahead. As the miles rolled by, I began to notice something odd about the vehicle I was following. The lights never wavered, never brightened or dimmed the way brake lights should when a driver touches the pedal or releases it. They maintained that same consistent intensity, that same perfect spacing, as if they were painted on the fog itself. I tried to make out more details of the vehicle, leaning forward in my seat and squinting through the windshield, but the fog seemed to thicken around those lights, creating a bubble of impenetrable gray. My CB radio crackled to life and a gravelly voice cut through the static. "Eastbound, big truck following the lights near marker 214, you copy?" I grabbed the handset, surprised that someone had noticed me in this soup. "Yeah, I copy. This is eastbound Peterbilt at your location." The voice came back immediately, tinged with something I couldn't quite identify, concern maybe, or confusion. "Driver, I'm not showing any vehicle ahead of you on my radar. You might want to slow it down." I glanced at my speedometer and realized I was doing nearly 60, much faster than I should have been in these conditions. But those red letters ahead seemed to be maintaining their distance perfectly, drawing me forward at this increased pace. I eased off the throttle, and the lights seemed to slow as well, always staying just far enough ahead to be visible, but never close enough to reveal the vehicle that supposedly carried them. The fog began to play tricks with sound as well as sight. My engine's rumble seemed muffled and distant, as if I were hearing it from outside the cab rather than sitting directly above it. The radio's volume seemed to fluctuate without my touching the dial, the talk show host's voice fading in and out like a weak signal from very far away. But strangest of all, I began to hear another engine, a different rhythm entirely, coming from somewhere ahead. It was older, rougher, the sound of a truck that had seen too many miles and not enough maintenance. I tried the CB again, calling out to any drivers in the area, but received only static in response. The red lights ahead continued their steady progress through the fog, and I found myself unable to look away from them. They had become hypnotic in their consistency, twin beacons that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The fog swirled around them in patterns that almost looked deliberate, as if it were being pushed aside by something much larger than those two small lights suggested. That's when I noticed the cold. Despite my heater running, the temperature in the cab began to drop noticeably. My breath started to fog slightly, and I could feel the chill creeping through the metal of my door and up through the floorboard. I turned the heater up higher, but the cold continued to intensify, bringing with it a strange smell, like ozone mixed with something organic and unpleasant, something that reminded me of roadkill left too long in the sun. The speedometer showed that I was somehow doing nearly 70 now, though I couldn't remember increasing my speed. The red lights ahead maintained their perfect distance, never getting closer, never falling behind. I tried to slow down, but my foot felt heavy on the accelerator, as if some invisible force were pressing down on it. The engine's pitch rose slightly, and I could feel the truck responding despite my intentions. I began to panic, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. The fog outside had taken on an almost greenish tint in the glow of my headlights, and the red lights ahead seemed to pulse more rapidly now, matching the increased beating of my heart. I tried the radio again, searching for any station, any human voice to anchor me to reality, but found only empty static across the entire dial. Then, without warning, the red lights began to rise. Not quickly, but with a steady, impossible ascent that defied every law of physics I understood. They lifted away from the roadway, still maintaining their perfect spacing, still glowing with that unwavering intensity. I watched in horror as they climbed higher into the fog, 20 feet above the pavement, then 30, then 40, until they disappeared entirely into the gray ceiling above. My truck suddenly lurched forward as if released from some invisible tether. The speedometer needle swung wildly before settling back to a reasonable 50 miles per hour, and I felt control return to my limbs. The cold in the cab began to dissipate, replaced by the warm air from my heater, and the fog around me seemed to thin slightly, revealing more of the familiar highway ahead. I pulled over at the next truck stop, my hand shaking as I navigated to a parking spot among the other big rigs. The fog was still thick, but it felt normal now, just weather instead of something malevolent and alive. I sat in my idling truck for nearly an hour, trying to make sense of what I had experienced, trying to convince myself that fatigue and isolation had simply played tricks on my mind. The next morning, when the fog finally lifted with the sunrise, I spoke with several other drivers who had been on the same stretch of highway. None of them reported seeing any vehicle matching the description of what I had followed, and the driver with the radar confirmed that his equipment had shown the road ahead of me completely empty for miles. But one old-timer, a guy who had been driving these routes since the 70s, listened to my story with knowing eye. He told me about accidents from decades past, about drivers who had lost control in fog and weather, about lights that some claimed to see on certain nights when the conditions were just right. He said the locals had stories about such things, about vehicles that existed somewhere between memory and reality, leading travelers through dangerous conditions until they were no longer needed. I still drive that route regularly, and I've encountered heavy fog many times since that October night. But I've never again seen those perfectly steady red lights piercing through the gray. Never felt that strange compulsion to follow something that might not have been there at all. Sometimes, late at night when the conditions are particularly bad, I find myself looking for them, part of me hoping to see them again, part of me terrified that I might. The radio still plays its late-night programs about unexplained phenomena, and occasionally I hear other drivers calling in with stories that sound remarkably similar to my own. I listen carefully to each account, wondering if those lights are still out there somewhere, still guiding lost travelers through the fog, still defying explanation in the space between what we know and what we fear might be true. The exit that never should have been. From Marcus. The rain had been my companion for 300 miles, drumming steadily against the windshield of my Peterbilt as I drove through the Pennsylvania mountains in the small hours of morning. The wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, competing with the low hum of the diesel engine that had carried me safely across half the continent. I was hauling electronics from Detroit to Baltimore, a routine run I'd made dozens of times before, but tonight felt different somehow, stretched thin like old rubber about to snap. The fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and I'd been watching for a truck stop for the last 40 miles. The GPS had gone silent after losing signal in these mountain passes, leaving me with nothing but the yellow center line and the occasional green highway sign emerging from the darkness like phosphorescent ghosts. My CB radio crackled with static, picking up fragments of distant conversations that faded in and out like voices from another world. That's when I saw it, appearing suddenly in my headlight beams like something conjured from the storm itself. A weathered exit sign, its reflective letters catching my lights awkwardly, as if they'd been hand-painted rather than manufactured. Exit 127, it read, with an arrow pointing into what looked like absolute darkness. Beneath it, a smaller sign promised services, gas, and lodging, though the lettering seemed oddly faded, as if it had been there far longer than the newer interstate signs I'd been following. I almost drove past, something deep in my gut telling me to keep rolling despite the fuel situation, but the practical trucker in me won out. I'd been driving for 11 hours, pushing the legal limits, and my bladder was about as full as my fuel tank was empty. The exit ramp curved away from the interstate in a gentle arc, descending through thick pine trees that seemed to press closer to the asphalt than they should have, their branches occasionally scraping against the trailer with sounds like fingernails on metal. The road at the bottom of the ramp was narrower than I expected, barely wide enough for my rig, and paved with an older style of asphalt that made my tires sing a different tune. No streetlights guided my way, just the twin beams of my headlights cutting through the rain and revealing glimpses of forest on either side. The trees here seemed different somehow, their trunks twisted in ways that suggested great age, or some fundamental wrongness in their growing. After what felt like miles but couldn't have been more than one, the forest opened up and I found myself approaching what appeared to be a small town. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything looked, despite the early morning hour when towns usually showed at least some signs of life. Delivery trucks making rounds, early shift workers heading to factories, coffee shops glowing with warm light. Here nothing stirred except the rain, which seemed to fall more heavily now, creating pools of standing water that reflected my headlights like scattered mirrors. The main street stretched before me, lined with buildings that looked like they'd been frozen in time somewhere around 1962. A diner with a neon sign that flickered erratically, spelling out Mel's, in letters that buzzed and hummed with electrical problems. A gas station with pumps that belonged in a museum, their round glass tops glowing with an amber light that seemed too warm, too inviting. A motel with a vacancy sign that blinked on and off in a rhythm that didn't quite match normal electrical patterns. I pulled into the gas station, the air brakes hissing as I brought the rig to a stop beside pumps that looked like they predated credit card readers by decades. The station itself was a small building with large windows that should have revealed the interior, but the glass seemed strangely dark, as if painted black from the inside. Above the door, a bell hung motionless despite the wind that was now gusting hard enough to rock my trailer slightly. The silence that followed when I shut off the engine was profound, deeper than normal small-town quiet. Even the rain seemed muffled here, pattering against my cab windows with less urgency than it had on the interstate. I climbed down from the driver's seat, my boots splashing in puddles that reflected not just my headlights, but other lights I couldn't identify. strange glows that seemed to come from the buildings themselves. The gas pumps were the old-fashioned kind with mechanical numbers that rolled over with audible clicks, and they took cash only, according to a hand-lettered sign taped to one of them. The prices were impossibly low, suggesting these pumps hadn't been updated in decades, which should have been my first real warning that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. But I was tired, focused on getting fuel and getting back on the road, and I missed the obvious signs that would have been clear to me under normal circumstances. I tried the station door, hoping to prepay and use the restroom, but it was locked, despite the lights being on inside. Through the dark windows I could make out shadowy shapes that might have been shelves and a counter, but no movement, no sign of an attendant. The bell above the door remained completely still, as if the air here followed different rules than the air I was used to breathing. Walking back to the pumps, I noticed that the numbers on the mechanical displays were moving slowly, rolling backward rather than forward, counting down rather than up. The amber lights in the pump tops seemed brighter now, and within them I could see shapes moving, dark forms that swirled like smoke, but more purposeful, more aware. The smell in the air wasn't gasoline and rain as it should have been, but something else, something organic and earthy that reminded me of old mushrooms and wet leaves. The hose felt wrong in my hands, heavier than it should have been, and warm despite the cold rain. When I squeezed the trigger, the liquid that came out looked like gasoline and smelled like gasoline, but it moved differently, flowing in spirals as if it had a mind of its own. The sound it made hitting my fuel tank was wrong too, more like liquid hitting liquid than liquid hitting metal, as if my tank was already full of something else entirely. Behind me I heard the soft chiming of the diner's door opening, followed by footsteps splashing through puddles in a rhythm that was almost but not quite human. I turned to see a figure approaching through the rain, someone wearing what looked like a waitress uniform from the 60s, complete with a small paper hat that should have been soaked through but appeared completely dry. Her face was kind and smiling, but her eyes reflected my headlights like an animal's eyes, giving off their own pale glow. "You look tired, honey," she said in a voice that carried clearly despite the rain and wind. "Why don't you come inside where it's warm? We've got fresh coffee and pie, and you can rest as long as you need to. The road will still be there when you're ready." Something in her voice made me want to follow her, made the idea of sitting in a warm diner booth with coffee and pie seem like the most reasonable thing in the world. But some deeper instinct, the survival mechanism that had kept me alive through 20 years of long-haul trucking, was screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. The way she stood perfectly still while inviting me inside, the way the rain seemed to pass through her rather than around her, the way her smile never changed despite the conversation. More figures were emerging from the other buildings now, all dressed in clothing from decades past, all moving with that same, not quite human gait. A mechanic in coveralls that should have been stained with grease but were pristine. A motel clerk in a bow tie and vest, carrying keys on a ring that jangled with sounds like small bells. A police officer with a badge that caught no light, despite being presumably made of metal. They were all converging on the gas station with the slow, inexorable movement of people who had all the time in the world, and their collective attention was focused entirely on me. Their faces were friendly, welcoming, but their eyes all held that same reflective quality, that same inner light that belonged to something other than human beings. I yanked the fuel hose from my tank without bothering to top it off completely, not caring that gasoline splashed on my boots or that the pump was still running. The mechanical numbers were spinning wildly now, backward and forward in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The amber lights in the pump tops were pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, and the shapes inside them were pressing against the glass as if trying to get out. My hands shook as I climbed back into the cab, fighting with the door handle as if it didn't want to open for me. The engine turned over slower than usual, coughing and hesitating as if the fuel I'd just pumped wasn't quite compatible with my mechanical systems. Behind me, I could hear the figures calling out in chorus, their voices blending together into something that was almost singing, almost chanting. Words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They weren't angry that I was leaving, I realized as I got the engine started and put the truck in gear. The empty fleet? From Marcus Coleman. The first time I saw them, I thought it was just another convoy running late-night freight through the Nevada desert. 3 identical white Peterbilts stretched out along Interstate 80, their chrome bumpers catching the moonlight like silver teeth. I'd been driving these routes for 23 years, hauling everything from electronics to livestock across the western states, and convoys were common enough. What wasn't common was the way they moved, perfectly synchronized, maintaining exactly the same distance between each truck, never wavering from their formation even when the highway curved through the rocky outcroppings that jutted up from the desert floor like ancient monuments. I was running behind schedule myself that night, pushing my aging Kenworth harder than I probably should have, trying to make up time after a delayed pickup in Sacramento. The CB radio had been quiet for hours, which wasn't unusual on this stretch of road. Most drivers preferred to keep to themselves during these lonely midnight runs, content with nothing but the steady rumble of diesel engines and the hypnotic rhythm of tires on asphalt. But something about the silence felt different tonight. Heavier somehow, as if the very air was holding its breath. The 3 white trucks had appeared in my mirrors around midnight, emerging from the darkness behind me like ghosts materializing from the ether. At first they were just distant headlights, barely visible specks in the vast emptiness of the desert. But gradually they gained ground, their powerful engines eating up the miles with mechanical precision. I expected them to pass me eventually. Most convoys ran faster than my old rig could manage on a good day, but instead, they settled into formation behind me, maintaining a steady distance that never varied by so much as a foot. Hours passed in this strange procession, my truck leading the silent convoy through the desert darkness. The moon hung low and full overhead, casting everything in an ethereal silver glow that made the landscape look like the surface of some alien world. Joshua trees stretched their twisted arms toward the star-filled sky, and in the distance mountain ranges rose like sleeping giants against the horizon. It would have been beautiful if not for the growing unease that crept up my spine like cold fingers. I tried raising the convoy on the CB several times, cycling through the standard channels truckers used for road communication. Breaker 19, this is the blue Kenworth northbound on 80, looking to chat with that white convoy running behind me. Nothing but static answered back, the kind of empty white noise that seemed to absorb all other sounds. I adjusted the squelch, checked the connections, even gave the radio a gentle tap with my knuckles. Everything appeared to be working normally, but still no response came from the 3 trucks that continued their relentless pursuit. As the night wore on, I began to notice other peculiarities about my mysterious companions. Their headlights never dimmed or brightened, never adjusted for oncoming traffic or changing road conditions. They simply maintained the same steady intensity, cutting through the darkness with laser-like precision. More unsettling was the way they navigated the gentle curves and rolling hills of the highway. Most drivers, even experienced ones, make minor adjustments constantly, subtle corrections to stay centered in their lane, slight variations in speed as they react to changing conditions. But these 3 trucks moved as if they were riding on invisible rails, never deviating from their perfect formation. The first real chill of fear touched me when I realized I couldn't see any movement in their cabs. At this distance and in the darkness, I shouldn't have been able to make out much detail anyway, but there was something wrong with the way the light from my own running lights reflected off their windshields. The glass looked too dark, too empty, as if nothing existed behind it but an endless void. I told myself it was just the angle, the way the moonlight was hitting the glass, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Around 3 in the morning, I decided to test my growing suspicions. I gradually reduced my speed, dropping from 70 miles per hour down to 60, then 50. The 3 white trucks slowed with me, maintaining that same precise distance, as if we were all connected by invisible cables. When I sped up again, they matched my acceleration perfectly, their engines responding in perfect synchronization. There was no variation, no human hesitation or reaction time. It was as if they were reading my intentions before I fully formed them myself. The highway ahead stretched endlessly into the darkness, marked only by the occasional reflective sign that flashed past like distant stars. Rest areas and truck stops were rare on this stretch of road, but I knew there was a way station coming up in about 50 miles. It would be closed at this hour, but it would give me a chance to pull off and see what these mysterious drivers would do. The thought of confronting them directly made my hands shake slightly on the steering wheel, but I had to know what I was dealing with. As we climbed a long grade that wound through a series of low hills, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In the side mirror of the lead truck behind me, where the driver should have been visible for just a moment, as we passed under an overhead light, there was nothing. Not shadow, not darkness, but an absence so complete it seemed to swallow the light around it. I blinked hard, convinced my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the impression remained the same. Whatever was guiding these trucks, it wasn't human. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly swerved into the guardrail, but instead of voices, all I heard was a sound like wind rushing through empty spaces, punctuated by a rhythmic clicking that reminded me unpleasantly of typing on an old mechanical keyboard. The sounds continued for several minutes, rising and falling in intensity as if carrying some kind of coded message. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the transmission cut off, leaving only the familiar hum of my engine and the whisper of wind across my cab. My fuel gauge was approaching the quarter tank mark, and I knew I would need to stop soon, regardless of what my mysterious escorts might do. There was a 24-hour truck stop about 30 miles ahead, a bright oasis of neon and diesel fumes that had been serving night drivers for decades. I had stopped there countless times over the years, knew the layout like the back of my hand. If I was going to make a move, it would have to be there. The truck stop appeared on the horizon like a miniature city, its signs and lights visible for miles across the flat desert. As I downshifted and activated my turn signal, I watched carefully in my mirrors to see what the convoy would do. For a moment, nothing changed. The 3 white trucks continued their forward motion as if they intended to pass right by, but then, in a movement so perfectly coordinated it sent chills down my spine, all 3 vehicles activated their turn signals simultaneously and began following me toward the exit ramp. I pulled into the truck stop's parking area, my heart hammering against my ribs as I maneuvered into a space near the main building. The 3 white trucks rolled past me slowly, their engines making no sound I could hear, despite being only yards away. They arranged themselves in a neat row at the far end of the lot, their headlights clicking off in perfect unison. In the sudden darkness that followed, I could barely make out their silhouettes against the star-filled sky. For several minutes I sat in my cab, engine idling, trying to work up the courage to walk over and investigate. The truck stop's fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting shifting pools of harsh white light across the asphalt. A few other trucks were scattered around the lot, their drivers presumably sleeping in their bunks, unaware of the strange arrival. Everything looked normal, familiar, but there was an undercurrent of wrongness that made my skin crawl. I finally shut down my engine and stepped out into the cool desert air. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the truck stop's generators and the occasional chirp of insects hidden in the scrub brush that grew along the lot's perimeter. As I walked slowly toward the 3 white trucks, my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the gravel surface. The first truck looked completely normal from the outside, its paint job pristine and its chrome fittings gleaming despite what must have been thousands of miles on the road. I peered through the driver's side window, cupping my hands against the glass to block the glare from the overhead lights. The cab was empty, but not just empty of people. There was no seat, no dashboard, no steering wheel. The interior was a smooth, featureless void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A sound behind me made me spin around, my heart leaping into my throat. But it was only another truck driver, a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt, who was walking toward the building with a thermos in his hand. He nodded at me casually as he passed, apparently seeing nothing unusual about the 3 identical trucks, or my obvious distress. I started to call out to him, to ask if he had seen the convoy arrive, but something stopped me. What if he couldn't see them at all? What if I was the only one who could? When I turned, the station at mile marker 237, from Marcus Chen, the gentle rumble of my Peterbilt's engine had been my companion for the past 8 hours as I made my way through the Nevada desert, hauling a load of electronics from Reno to Phoenix. The dashboard clock glowed a soft amber, reading just past 2 in the morning, and my fuel gauge was dancing dangerously close to empty. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant trucker chatter, but mostly it was just me, the endless ribbon of asphalt, and the steady thrum of 18 wheels eating up the miles. I had been driving this route for nearly 15 years, and I knew every truck stop, every diner, every landmark between here and there. So when I saw the neon glow cutting through the desert darkness ahead, advertising Desert Rose Gas and Go, at mile marker 237, I felt a peculiar sensation creep up my spine. I couldn't recall ever seeing this place before, though the weathered sign and faded paint job suggested it had been here for decades. The station sat alone in a pool of flickering fluorescent light, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and sand stretching to the dark horizon. A few moths danced around the overhead lights, their shadows creating strange patterns on the cracked concrete. The building itself looked like something from the 1960s, all angles and atomic age design, with large windows that reflected my headlights as I pulled in. 2 old-fashioned pumps stood sentinel in the center of the lot, their round glass tops glowing like cybernetic eyes. As I eased my rig alongside the diesel pump, I noticed an old Ford pickup truck parked near the building, its paint job so faded I couldn't make out the original color. The engine ticked and pinged in the cooling night air, and I could see someone moving around inside the station's bright interior. At least I wouldn't be dealing with one of those automated pay-at-the-pump situations that always seem to malfunction in the middle of nowhere. The diesel flowed steadily into my tanks while I stretched my legs and breathed in the cool desert air. There was something oddly sweet about the breeze tonight, like jasmine or honeysuckle, which seemed impossible out here in this stark landscape. The scent made me think of my grandmother's garden back in California, where I'd spent summers as a child helping her tend to her flowers. Strange how memory works, triggered by the smallest sensory details. The pump clicked off at exactly 200 gallons, and I headed inside to pay and grab some coffee for the road. The door chimed with an old-fashioned bell, the kind you might find in a small-town pharmacy or general store. The interior was surprisingly spacious, with shelves lined with snacks, magazines, and various truck driver necessities. Everything looked clean but somehow dated, as if time had slowed down inside this little oasis. Behind the counter stood a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a uniform that looked straight out of the Eisenhower era. Her name tag read Dolores in faded plastic letters. She smiled warmly as I approached, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that suggested genuine friendliness rather than the practiced customer service smile I was used to seeing at most truck stops. "Good evening, honey," she said, her voice carrying a slight southwestern drawl. "I hope you found everything you need. That's quite a beautiful rig you've got out there. They sure don't make them like that anymore, do they?" I handed her my card and mentioned the diesel purchase, noting that her hands looked rougher than I'd expected, calloused and weathered like someone who'd worked hard labor for many years. There were liver spots on the backs of her hands that seemed inconsistent with her apparent age, but the lighting in these places could play tricks on your eyes. Been driving long? She asked while processing my payment, and I told her about my 15 years on the road. She nodded knowingly, as if she'd heard similar stories countless times before. Time sure does fly, doesn't it? She mused, handing me back my card. Seems like yesterday I started working here, but it's been... oh, what feels like forever now. Some nights I can barely remember what I looked like when I first walked through that door. Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, I could see fine lines around her eyes that I hadn't noticed before, and her hair seemed to have more gray threads woven through it than when I'd first walked in. But that was impossible, of course. I'd only been in the store for maybe 5 minutes. "You okay, miss?" I asked, suddenly concerned. "You look a little tired." She touched her face self-consciously, her fingers tracing the lines around her eyes as if she was discovering them for the first time. "Oh, I'm fine, honey. Just been a long shift. They seem to get longer every night, you know." I grabbed a coffee from the pot near the register, noting that it was surprisingly fresh and aromatic for this time of night. Most truck stops served coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. As I doctored it with cream and sugar, I glanced out the window at my truck and saw someone standing near the old Ford pickup. The figure appeared to be an elderly man, bent and moving slowly, but in the shifting shadows cast by the flickering overhead lights, it was hard to make out any details. He seemed to be having trouble with something, possibly his keys, or maybe just getting his bearings. The compassionate part of me wanted to go help, but something about the way he moved, the odd, jerky quality of his motion, made me hesitate. "That's probably old Tom," Dolores said, following my gaze. "He stops in here regular, usually around this time. Sweet old gentleman, though. He seems to have more trouble getting around than he used to. Age catches up with all of us eventually, I suppose." When I looked back at her, I felt a chill run down my spine. Dolores looked noticeably older than she had just moments before. The lines in her face had deepened, and there were now distinct streaks of silver in her hair. Her uniform seemed to hang on her frame differently, as if she had somehow become smaller, more fragile. "Ma'am, are you sure you're feeling all right?" I asked again, my voice betraying my growing concern and confusion. She moved to a mirror behind the counter, perhaps to check her appearance, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. For a long moment she stared at her reflection, her hand moving to her throat, and I could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I don't understand," she whispered. "This morning I looked. How long have I been here tonight?" The question sent ice through my veins because I realized I couldn't remember exactly when my shift had started. I'd been driving for 8 hours, yes, but the time before that seemed strangely hazy. Had I slept at a rest area earlier? Had I stopped for a meal somewhere? The memories felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Outside, I could hear footsteps approaching the building, slow and deliberate. Through the window, I could see the elderly man from the pickup truck getting closer, and now I could make out more details of his appearance. His clothes looked far too large for his diminished frame, hanging on him like empty sacks. His hair was white and thin, barely covering a spotted scalp, and he moved with the careful, calculated steps of someone whose bones and joints were betraying them. But most disturbing was his face. Even through the glass and the uncertain light, I could see an expression of absolute terror, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. His eyes kept darting between the building and something beyond it, something I couldn't see from my position inside. The door chimes rang again as he entered, and immediately I understood why Dolores had called him Old Tom. But this man wasn't just elderly. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles and age spots, his hands shaking with palsy as he tried to reach for his wallet. When he spoke, his voice was thin and reedy, like wind through dried leaves. "Need to pay for gas," he managed to say, and I could hear the effort each word cost him. "Don't know why it's taking so long. Feels like I've been trying to fill up that damn truck for hours." I looked out at his Ford pickup again, and my blood turned to ice water. The truck was visibly more rusted than when I'd first arrived, with patches of corrosion that definitely hadn't been there before. The paint was even more faded, and one of the tires looked dangerously low. "Tom?" Dolores said gently, her own voice now carrying the quaver of advanced age. "Maybe you should call someone to come get you. Your truck doesn't look safe to drive." But Tom was staring at her with growing horror. "Dolores, my God, what's the fork that wasn't on the map?" From Carl Henderson. "I've been driving these highways for 23 years, and I thought I knew every mile of asphalt between Portland and Denver like the back of my weathered hands. My Peterbilt 379 and I had traced those routes so many times that I could navigate them in my sleep, feeling each curve and grade through the steering wheel, hearing the subtle changes in my engine's rumble that told me exactly where I was, even in complete darkness. But on that October night, with a fine mist turning the world beyond my headlights into something that looked more like a watercolor painting left out in the rain, I discovered that even the most familiar roads can hide secrets. The load I was carrying wasn't anything special, just furniture bound for a warehouse in Colorado. But the dispatcher had been insistent about the delivery window. I'd been pushing hard since Sacramento, taking only the minimum required rest stops, and my CB had been crackling with other drivers' voices throughout the evening. The usual chatter about speed traps and good coffee, weather reports and complaints about DOT inspections, normal stuff that made the long miles feel less lonely. But as I climbed into the Cascade foothills, the radio had gone quiet, leaving me with nothing but the steady thrum of my diesel engine and the rhythmic sweep of my wipers across the windshield. The GPS mounted to my dashboard showed the familiar blue line of Highway 26, that reliable ribbon of road I'd traveled countless times before. 2 lanes in each direction, cutting through dense forests of Douglas fir and cedar, with the occasional small town breaking up the wilderness. I knew every truck stop, every way station, every place where the state troopers liked to hide with their radar gun. But then, somewhere past the town of Rhododendron, my headlights picked up something that shouldn't have been there. A fork in the road appeared ahead, splitting off to the right at an angle that seemed almost organic, like the asphalt had grown that way instead of being laid down by human hands. The new road looked exactly like the main highway, same width, same yellow lines painted down the center, same reflective markers glowing in the sweep of my lights. But it wasn't on my GPS. The blue dot that represented my truck continued straight along the mapped route, as if the fork simply didn't exist. I slowed down, downshifting until the engine brake caught with its familiar rumble, and peered through the windshield at this impossible piece of infrastructure. The strange thing was how natural it looked, how perfectly it seemed to belong there. The guardrails matched the existing ones, slightly weathered and showing the same patina of age. The road surface appeared to be in good condition, recently maintained, with fresh paint on the lane markers that gleamed wetly in the mist. Even the signage looked official, a green rectangle with white letters that read "Alternate Route," in the same font and style used by the State Highway Department. Everything about it suggested legitimacy, except for the fact that it absolutely should not have existed. I pulled my rig to a stop on the shoulder and reached for my CB radio, intending to ask if any other drivers had noticed this new piece of road. But the radio produced nothing except static, a soft white noise that seemed to match the sound of rain on my roof. I tried different channels, working my way through the trucker's frequencies and even checking the emergency band, but found only that gentle hiss of electronic silence. My cell phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't entirely unusual in this part of the mountains, but the timing felt significant. Something about the fork drew my attention back to it, a subtle pull that I couldn't quite explain. The road curved gently to the right, disappearing into the forest with what seemed like a welcoming gesture. My headlights illuminated the first 100 yards or so, revealing smooth asphalt that looked freshly paved, and I found myself wondering where it might lead. Perhaps it was a new bypass, built to handle overflow traffic during the busy summer tourist season. Maybe the highway department had finished the construction recently enough that the mapping services hadn't caught up yet. The logical thing would have been to continue straight, following my GPS and my years of experience along the proven route. But something about the monotony of the main highway suddenly felt oppressive. The thought of another 4 hours of the same curves, the same mile markers, the same truck stops I'd visited hundreds of times before, filled me with an unexpected sense of weariness. The alternate route promised something different, a break from the routine that had defined my professional life for more than 2 decades. I eased my truck back onto the highway and turned right at the fork, feeling the slight change in road surface as my 18 wheels rolled onto this mysterious new pavement. The sensation was subtly different, somehow smoother than the main highway, as if the asphalt had been laid with particular care. My suspension absorbed the transition without the usual bump or jolt, and I found myself settling into a comfortable cruise as the unknown road stretched ahead. The forest on both sides seemed denser here, the trees pressing closer to the pavement than they had on the main highway. Ancient firs towered into the misty darkness, their branches forming a canopy that my headlights couldn't penetrate. Occasionally I caught glimpses of what might have been structures deeper in the woods, angular shadows that could have been buildings or might have been nothing more than fallen logs and rocky outcroppings. The road itself continued to impress me with its quality, perfectly banked curves that let me maintain speed without feeling any of the usual stress on my cargo straps. Mile after mile passed without any indication of where this route might be taking me. No signs marked distances to towns or cities, no mile markers provided reference points, no rest areas or scenic overlooks broke the endless wall of trees. My GPS continued to show my truck as being somewhere else entirely, the blue dot faithfully following Highway 26 while I drove through this unmapped territory. The disconnect between my actual location and what my technology insisted was true began to create a strange sense of displacement, as if I had somehow stepped outside the normal world without realizing it. The fuel gauge showed I still had plenty of diesel, but I began to wonder what would happen if I ran low while traveling this mysterious route. Would there be truck stops ahead, or would I find myself stranded in this forest that seemed to exist outside normal geography? The thought should have been more concerning than it was, but somehow the smooth rhythm of the road and the gentle sound of rain on the windshield created an almost hypnotic calm that made practical worries feel distant and unimportant. It was then that I began to notice other vehicles, at first just taillights in the distance ahead, red dots that appeared and disappeared around curves like fireflies in the forest. Then I started seeing headlights in my mirrors, other travelers who had apparently chosen this same alternate route. The sight should have been reassuring, proof that I wasn't alone on this strange road. But something about the other vehicles struck me as odd. They all seemed to maintain exactly the same speed, staying at precisely the same distances from each other and from my truck. No one passed, no one fell behind, and no one seemed to vary their pace even slightly. When I tried to get a better look at my fellow travelers, adjusting my mirrors and even leaning forward to peer through the misty darkness, the details remained frustratingly elusive. The vehicles appeared to be a mix of cars and trucks, but their specific makes and models seemed to shift and blur whenever I focused on them. Headlights that looked round from a distance might appear rectangular when they came closer, then round again when I looked back. License plates remained unreadable despite seeming to be well within the range of my vision. The road began to change, subtly, the curves becoming more frequent and the grade starting to climb more steeply than seemed possible for this region. According to every map I'd ever studied, Highway 26 through this area was relatively flat, following river valleys and natural contours that avoided significant elevation changes. But this alternate route seemed to be taking me up into higher country, winding through terrain that should have been dozens of miles to the north or south. The air pressure change made my ears pop, and I found myself downshifting more frequently to handle grades that appeared without warning. Then I saw the lights ahead, a warm yellow glow that suggested civilization after miles of empty forest. As I rounded a sweeping curve, a truck stop materialized out of the mist, looking exactly like dozens of others I'd visited throughout my career. Fuel islands under a canopy, a main building with large windows glowing invitingly, and what appeared to be a decent-sized parking area for overnight stops. The familiar sight should have been welcome, but something about it triggered a deep unease that I couldn't immediately identify. The other vehicles I'd been following continued straight past the truck stop without slowing, their taillights disappearing around the next curve as if the opportunity for fuel and rest held no interest for them. I found myself with a choice: follow them into the continued unknown, or pull in and try to get my bearings. My fuel gauge still showed adequate reserves, but the idea of a hot cup of coffee and perhaps some answers about this mysterious road proved irresistible. I downshifted and activated my turn signal, though. The voices between the walls. From Marcus. The Interstate 40 stretched endlessly before me that October night, my Peterbilt's headlights cutting through the darkness like twin swords through black velvet. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the southwestern states, and I thought I knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every peculiar sound my truck could make. The steady rumble of the diesel engine had become my lullaby, the gentle sway of the cab my cradle. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arm stand on end. The weather had turned unexpectedly cold for New Mexico in October, forcing me to kick on the heating system for the first time this season. The air vents came to life with their familiar mechanical whisper, pushing warm air through the cab's interior with a soft rushing sound that usually brought comfort during long, lonely nights on the road. But as the miles rolled beneath my 18 wheels and the desert landscape blurred past my windows, I began to notice something unusual threading through that mechanical white noise, something that made me adjust my grip on the steering wheel and lean forward slightly in my seat. At first, I convinced myself it was just the normal settling sounds of an aging truck, the kind of audio artifacts that every long-haul driver learns to distinguish between normal and concerning. My Peterbilt had over 400,000 miles on her odometer, and she'd earned every creak, groan, and whistle that echoed through her frame during the quiet hours between cities. The heating system hadn't been used in months, so it made sense that dust and debris might create unusual sounds as they burned off the heating elements. But these sounds seemed almost too organized, too rhythmic to be random mechanical noise. The whispers started so subtly that I almost missed them entirely, like voices heard through water or conversations drifting from another room. They wove themselves seamlessly into the constant rush of air from the vents, rising and falling with a cadence that seemed almost musical, almost intentional. I found myself unconsciously holding my breath during the quieter moments, straining to catch individual words or phrases, but the sounds remained just beyond the threshold of comprehension, tantalizingly close to meaning, but never quite resolving into actual speech. Mile after mile, the whispers grew more distinct, more insistent, as if whatever was creating them was gaining strength or confidence. I tried adjusting the fan speed, thinking that perhaps a different airflow might eliminate the strange acoustics, but the voices adapted to each new setting, maintaining their mysterious presence regardless of how I manipulated the controls. When I switched the system to recirculate, hoping to change the air pressure dynamics, the whispers seemed to grow more intimate, as if they were now coming from inside the cab itself, rather than being drawn in from outside. The desert night pressed against my windows like a living thing, the darkness so complete that my headlights seemed to create the world as I moved through it, illuminating sagebrush and rock formations that appeared and vanished like ghosts. The moon hung thin and pale overhead, providing barely enough light to distinguish the horizon from the star-scattered sky. And in this isolated vastness, the whispers became my only companions besides the steady thrumming of the engine and the gentle hiss of air brakes when I navigated the occasional hill. As the night deepened and my fatigue began to accumulate behind my eyes like sand, the voices started to sound more familiar, carrying inflections and tonal qualities that reminded me of people I'd known throughout my life. I heard echoes of my ex-wife's laugh, the gentle scolding tone my mother had used when I was a child, the encouraging words of my first dispatcher when I'd started driving professionally, but these weren't memories exactly. They were something stranger and more unsettling, as if the heating system had somehow tapped into a reservoir of human voices and was playing them back in an endless, overlapping chorus. The truck stop I'd been planning to reach for my mandatory rest break was still 90 miles ahead, but the whispers were making it difficult to concentrate on the road. They seemed to respond to my thoughts and emotions, growing softer when I tried to ignore them, and becoming more pronounced when I gave them my attention. During one particularly clear moment, I could swear I heard my own name being called, spoken in a voice that sounded like a combination of everyone I'd ever loved, and the sound sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night. I reached for the radio, hoping that some music or talk radio might mask the strange sounds, but as soon as I turned up the volume, the voices from the vents seemed to increase proportionally, maintaining their presence in the audio landscape of the cab. Even more disturbing, they began to harmonize with whatever was playing on the radio, creating an eerie musical accompaniment that transformed familiar songs into something alien and unsettling. The GPS on my dashboard showed that I was passing through a particularly remote section of highway, miles from the nearest town or service station, surrounded by nothing but empty desert and the occasional abandoned building or rusted vehicle beside the road. This was the kind of place where cellular service became spotty and help could be hours away if something went wrong. The kind of isolation that usually brought me peace but now felt oppressive and threatening. Without warning, the whispers suddenly coalesced into something unmistakably clear and direct. Multiple voices, speaking in perfect unison, said my name followed by a phrase that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Pull over, Marcus, we need to talk." The words came from every vent in the cab simultaneously, creating a surround sound effect that was impossible to ignore or dismiss as imagination. My hands began to shake on the steering wheel, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool night air. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to reach civilization, to find other people and lights and the familiar comfort of human activity. The whispers responded to my panic by becoming more insistent, more demanding, as if sensing my fear and feeding on it. They began speaking over each other, creating a cacophony of voices that filled the cab with urgent, overlapping conversations. Some seemed to be giving directions, others were asking questions, and still others were making statements about things they couldn't possibly know. Personal details about my life that I'd never shared with anyone. The heating vents began to rattle and shake as if something was moving through the ductwork, something larger than air. And I could hear scratching sounds coming from inside the dashboard, like fingernails on metal or small animals trying to claw their way out. The temperature in the cab started fluctuating wildly, alternating between stifling heat and Arctic cold in rapid cycles that left me gasping and disoriented. As I crested a small hill, I saw lights in the distance. The welcome glow of a truck stop's neon signs cutting through the darkness like a beacon of salvation. I pushed the Peterbilt to her maximum safe speed, the diesel engine roaring with effort as I raced toward those blessed lights. But the closer I got, the more frantic the voices became, as if they knew their time was running out and were making one final attempt to communicate their mysterious message. In the last mile before the truck stop, the voices suddenly stopped speaking in words and began making other sounds. Sounds that were unmistakably human but terrible to hear. There was weeping and laughter, screaming and singing, all mixed together in a symphony of emotion that seemed to represent every feeling a person could experience, compressed into a few horrible minutes. I covered my ears with one hand while steering with the other, but the sounds seemed to come from inside my skull rather than from the vents. I pulled into the truck stop with squealing brakes and immediately shut off the engine, killing the electrical system and plunging the cab into blessed silence. For several minutes I sat in the darkness, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant sounds of other trucks idling in the parking lot. Normal sounds that felt like music after what I'd experienced. My hands were still shaking as I climbed down from the cab and walked around the truck, examining the air intake vents and looking for any sign of what might have caused the phenomenon. Everything appeared normal. The heating system components looked standard and undamaged. The air filters were clean, and there was no evidence of any foreign objects or modifications that might explain what I'd heard. I spent 20 minutes checking and rechecking every accessible part of the system, but found nothing unusual, nothing that would account for the voices that had filled my cab for the past 100 miles. When I finally climbed back into the truck and started the engine, the heating system came on automatically, pushing warm air through the vents with its normal mechanical whisper. I held my breath, waiting for the voices to return, but heard only the expected sounds of moving air and working machinery. The rest of my drive passed without incident, the heating system functioning perfectly normally for the remaining hours until dawn. But even now, months later, I find myself listening carefully whenever I turn on the heat, waiting for those whispers to return. Sometimes, in the quietest moments of the night, when the road ahead is empty and the world seems to hold its breath, I think I can hear something moving through the vents again. Something that sounds almost like voices. The Rhythm of the Road, from Marcus Chen. The thing about long-haul trucking is that you learn to listen to your rig like it's speaking to you. Every vibration through the steering wheel, every shift in the engine's rumble, every creak and groan of the trailer behind you becomes part of a conversation that never ends. After 15 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 399, I thought I'd heard every sound she could make. The night I picked up that cargo bound for Denver proved me wrong in ways that still keep me checking my mirrors when the road gets too quiet. It was one of those November evenings when the sky hangs low and heavy, pregnant with snow that hasn't quite decided to fall yet. The dispatcher at Midwest Freight had called with a rush job, good money for a quick turnaround from Kansas City to Denver. The pickup was at some medical supply warehouse on the industrial side of town, the kind of place that stays lit with harsh fluorescence long after the sun gives up for the day. I'd hauled medical equipment before, mostly routine stuff, MRI machines and hospital beds. Nothing that ever gave me pause to wonder about what exactly I was carrying. The loading dock supervisor was a thin man with nervous hands who kept checking his clipboard like the words might rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking. He walked me around the trailer as his crew loaded whatever was going inside, but something felt off about the whole operation. Usually, medical cargo comes with detailed manifests and handling instructions, temperature requirements, that sort of thing. This time, all I got was a sealed envelope marked for the receiving facility and strict instructions not to open the trailer under any circumstances. The first few hours on the road passed without incident. Interstate 70 stretched out ahead of me like a ribbon of black glass, dotted with the occasional cluster of taillights or the sweep of oncoming headlights. My CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers. Complaints about construction zones and warnings about speed traps. The familiar soundtrack of the highway. The engine hummed its steady song, and the trailer rolled behind me as smooth as you please. Everything felt normal, routine even, until somewhere past the Kansas-Colorado border, when I started to notice something that made the hair on my arm stand up. There was a rhythm coming from the trailer that didn't match anything mechanical I knew. It wasn't the regular thump of road joints or the sway of cargo shifting with the curves. This was something else entirely, a steady pulse that seemed to sync up with my own heartbeat for a few measures before drifting slightly out of time. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, the product of too many energy drinks and not enough sleep, but as the miles rolled by, the sound became impossible to ignore. I pulled into a truck stop outside of Limon, Colorado, telling myself I just needed to stretch my legs and grab some coffee. The parking lot was half full of sleeping rigs, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber against the darkness. I walked slowly around my trailer, pressing my ear against the refrigerated aluminum sides, trying to locate the source of that rhythmic thumping. The sound was definitely coming from inside, a measured beat that reminded me uncomfortably of a massive heart pumping blood through unseen arteries. When I climbed back into the cab, I found myself staring at the sealed envelope the supervisor had given me. The paper felt expensive under my fingers, heavier than standard shipping documents. I held it up to the dome light, trying to make out any details through the thick paper, but all I could see were the faint outlines of what looked like medical symbols and a lot of fine print. Something about the weight of that envelope and the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it made me slide it back into the glove compartment without opening it, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to tear it open and read whatever was inside. Back on the highway, the rhythmic pulsing from the trailer grew stronger, more insistent. It seemed to respond to changes in my driving, speeding up when I accelerated, slowing down when I hit the brakes. The CB radio began picking up strange interference, voices that spoke in medical terminology I didn't understand, discussing procedures and protocols in calm, clinical tones that somehow managed to sound more frightening than any horror movie I'd ever seen. When I tried to join the conversation, asking for a radio check, the voices would stop mid-sentence, leaving only static and the distant sound of machinery that might have been life support equipment. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that looked more like smoke in the darkness. As I began the long climb up through the passes, the pulsing from my trailer synchronized perfectly with the labored beating of my own heart, creating a harmony that felt both intimately familiar and utterly wrong. I found myself pressing harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach Denver and unload whatever was back there. But the rhythm seemed to anticipate my urgency, growing stronger and more demanding with every mile. Somewhere in the high country, with snow beginning to dust my windshield, I made the mistake of looking in my side mirror during a long curve. The running lights along the top of my trailer were pulsing in perfect time with the sound I'd been hearing, creating a visual heartbeat that stretched out behind me like the spine of some enormous sleeping creature. Red lights, amber lights, all of them breathing together in a rhythm that seemed to be speeding up, growing more urgent, as if whatever was in that trailer was waking up after a long journey. I tried calling dispatch, but my radio picked up only dead air and the occasional burst of that clinical chatter. Doctors discussing vital signs and recommending increased dosages of medications I'd never heard of. The envelope in my glove compartment seemed to be growing heavier, and I could swear I felt it warming up, as if body heat was seeping through the paper from whatever information was printed inside. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I realized that my own pulse had completely synchronized with the rhythm coming from the trailer, as if whatever was back there had somehow tapped into my circulatory system and was conducting the tempo of my blood. The descent into Denver should have been a relief, city lights spreading out below like a circuit board, but instead I felt a growing sense of dread. The receiving facility was located in an industrial complex that looked more like a research installation than a medical supply warehouse. Tall fences topped with razor wire surrounded buildings that had no windows, only ventilation systems that hummed with mechanical precision. Security guards in white uniforms directed me to a loading dock where technicians in hazmat suits waited with equipment that looked far too sophisticated for routine cargo handling. As they disconnected my trailer, I felt a physical sensation of something being severed, like a cord being cut or an IV line being removed. The rhythmic pulsing stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a vacuum in my ears. The envelope in my glove compartment had cooled back to normal temperature, and when I finally worked up the courage to open it after the trailer had been taken away, I found nothing inside but standard shipping documentation for medical research equipment, routine and boring and completely inadequate to explain what I'd experienced on the road. They paid me in cash, crisp bills that smelled faintly of disinfectant, and sent me on my way with instructions to forget the delivery address and avoid discussing the nature of the cargo with anyone. I drove out of that facility with an empty flatbed trailer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed during those hours when my heartbeat had synchronized with whatever was riding behind me. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch my pulse keeping time with rhythms that don't belong to me, as if something from that cargo is still traveling along for the ride, a passenger I can't see, but can't seem to drop off at any destination. The highway still calls to me, routes and schedules and miles to cover, but I listen more carefully now to the sounds my rig makes, sorting through the mechanical voices to make sure none of them are beating in time with the blood in my veins. The Face in the Glass, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving 18-wheelers cross-country is that you get used to solitude in ways most people never will. Mile after mile of highway stretching endlessly ahead, the steady thrum of diesel engine and road noise becoming a kind of meditation. You learn to find comfort in the rhythm of it all, the predictable dance of gear shifts and brake checks, the familiar weight of the trailer pulling behind you like a loyal shadow. But sometimes, in those long stretches between truck stops when the world feels empty except for you and the asphalt, you start to notice things that don't quite fit the pattern you've grown to know. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I first saw her in my rearview mirror. I was hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Denver, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of construction delays outside Flagstaff. The highway had opened up into one of those seemingly endless stretches through northern Arizona, where the landscape rolls away into darkness on both sides, and the only lights you see are your own headlights cutting through the night. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, picking up nothing but fragments of distant stations that faded in and out like whispers. I'd been checking my mirrors regularly, as any good driver does, when I noticed the headlights behind me. Nothing unusual about that, except they seemed to have appeared suddenly, as if they'd materialized out of the darkness rather than gradually catching up from behind. The lights held steady about a quarter-mile back, matching my speed perfectly. In the side mirror, I could make out the silhouette of what looked like an older pickup truck, though the darkness made it difficult to determine the exact make or model. The miles rolled by, and those headlights stayed right there in that same position, never gaining ground, never falling back. It's not uncommon for vehicles to pace trucks on long stretches of highway, especially when there's not much traffic to worry about. Some drivers find it comforting to follow the steady pace of a big rig rather than constantly adjusting their speed. But something about this particular vehicle felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was bothering me. Around midnight, I reached for the thermos of coffee I'd filled at my last stop, and as I tilted the rearview mirror slightly to check my blind spot during the maneuver, the angle caught the interior light of the truck behind me just right. That's when I saw her face for the first time. She was sitting in the passenger seat of the pickup, and even at that distance, even in the dim glow of dashboard lights, I could see she was staring directly at my truck. Not just looking in the general direction of the highway ahead, but staring with an intensity that seemed to bridge the gap between our vehicles. Her face appeared pale in the greenish light of the pickup's dashboard, and her hair seemed to hang limp and dark around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Even across that quarter mile of asphalt, even in the distorted reflection of mirrors and darkness, those eyes seemed to be focused entirely on me, as if she could see right through the back of my trailer and into my cab. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just a trick of light and distance, maybe combined with too many hours on the road and too much caffeine. But every time I glanced in that mirror, she was still there, still staring with that unwavering intensity. The pickup maintained its steady distance, and the woman never seemed to move, never turned to look at something else or shifted in her seat the way passengers normally do on long drives. As the miles accumulated, I found myself checking the rear view mirror more frequently, almost compulsively. Each time, her face was there, in that same position, pale and unmoving in the dashboard glow. I started to wonder if maybe she was asleep with her eyes open, Or perhaps it was some kind of mannequin or decoration that was creating the illusion of a staring face. But the more I looked, the more convinced I became that those eyes were not only open, but actively tracking my movement. When I reached for my logbook to check my remaining driving hours, her head seemed to tilt slightly, following the motion. When I adjusted my mirrors, her position appeared to shift just enough to maintain that direct line of sight. The rational part of my mind kept insisting it was all coincidence and imagination, but the growing knot of unease in my stomach suggested otherwise. The highway began to climb into higher elevations, and patches of fog started to drift across the road like ghostly fingers. The pickup's headlights would disappear momentarily as we passed through these misty sections, only to emerge again, maintaining that exact same distance. But the woman's face remained visible whenever the fog cleared, still staring, still motionless, except for those subtle movements that seemed to follow my every action. Around 2 a.m, I decided to test my growing suspicion. I gradually reduced my speed from 70 to 65, watching carefully to see how the pickup would respond. The headlights maintained their distance perfectly, slowing at exactly the same rate as if the driver was anticipating my speed change rather than reacting to it. Then I accelerated back up to 75, and, again, the pickup matched my speed so precisely it felt choreographed. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In all the time I'd been watching that truck, I had never once seen the driver. The pickup clearly had someone behind the wheel because it was maintaining perfect control and responding to every variation in my speed. But no matter how I adjusted my mirrors or tried to catch different angles of reflection, I could only ever see the passenger side of the cab. And on the passenger side was always that pale woman with the dark hair and the staring eyes. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to channel 19, hoping to raise another driver who might be able to get a better look at the pickup from a different angle. But the radio produced nothing but static and the occasional burst of what sounded like distant voices, speaking in languages I couldn't identify. Every few minutes, I thought I could hear something that might have been my own voice echoing back through the static, as if my words were being reflected from somewhere far away. The fog grew thicker as we climbed higher into the mountains, and visibility dropped to just a few hundred yards. But somehow, those headlights behind me remained as clear and steady as ever, cutting through the mist as if it wasn't there at all. The woman's face, too, stayed perfectly visible in my rearview mirror, unaffected by the swirling gray blankets that made everything else fade into indistinct shapes. By 3 a.m, my nerves were stretched tight as piano wire. I decided to pull off at the next truck stop, thinking that would finally break whatever strange connection had developed between my rig and the mysterious pickup. When I saw the blue sign advertising fuel and food services at the next exit, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I put on my turn signal well in advance and began to ease toward the off-ramp. But as I made the turn, the pickup's headlights continued straight down the main highway without even slowing. I watched in my mirrors as they disappeared around a curve, finally breaking the connection that had held us together for over 3 hours. The woman's face vanished with them, leaving my mirrors reflecting only my own cab and the empty darkness behind me. At the truck stop, I parked under the bright fluorescent lights and sat in my cab for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The rational explanations I'd been clinging to seemed less convincing now that it was over. I kept telling myself it had been a coincidence, a case of 2 vehicles happening to travel at similar speeds for a few hours, combined with fatigue-induced paranoia on my part. But when I finally climbed down from my cab and walked toward the building, I caught sight of my own reflection in the truck stop's windows. My face looked pale in the fluorescent light, my hair hanging limp from hours under a baseball cap, my eyes wide and staring from the strain of constant mirror checking. For just a moment I looked remarkably similar to the woman I'd been watching in that pickup truck. I completed my mandatory rest period and resumed my journey toward Denver, but I couldn't shake the memory of those staring eyes, or the unsettling precision with which that pickup had matched my every movement. The remaining hours to my destination passed uneventfully, with normal traffic patterns and ordinary drivers who behaved in predictable ways. It wasn't until I was unloading my trailer at the furniture warehouse in Denver that one of the dock workers mentioned something that made my hands freeze on the dolly I was pulling. He said they'd had another driver come through the previous week who told a strange story about being followed by a pickup truck with a woman passenger who stared at him for hours through his mirrors. The driver had been so unsettled by the experience that he considered quitting long-haul runs altogether. As I drove my empty trailer toward my next pickup, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than necessary, searching the darkness behind me for headlights that maintained just the right distance. The Levy of Lost Souls. From Marcus. The rain had been hammering my windshield for 3 hours straight when I first saw the Lele through the gloom. It wasn't marked on any map I'd ever seen, and I'd been running this route between Glasgow and Newcastle for the better part of 15 years. But there it was, carved into the hillside like a wound in the earth, its entrance barely visible through the sheets of water cascading down from the Scottish Highlands above. My Scania's diesel engine rumbled beneath me, a comforting constant that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat over the years. The cab swayed gently as crosswinds buffeted the 40-foot trailer behind me, carrying machine parts bound for a factory that wouldn't miss them for another 8 hours. I'd been pushing hard to make up time after that delay at the depot, but the storm was making the A68 treacherous, and I could feel fatigue creeping into my bones like cold water through worn boots. The Lele seemed to beckon through the rain, its cracked tarmac surface gleaming under my headlights. A single street lamp stood at its center, casting a pale yellow pool of light that barely penetrated the darkness beyond. Something about that light felt wrong, too steady and bright for such an isolated spot. But exhaustion was clouding my judgment. I indicated left and felt the truck's weight shift as I guided her into the space, the engine's note dropping to a contented idle as I brought her to a stop. The sudden quiet was profound. Without the road noise and the constant thrum of tires on wet asphalt, I became acutely aware of smaller sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the whisper of rain against glass, and something else I couldn't quite place, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, barely audible, but persistent, like the distant drone of power lines on a still night. I reached for my thermos of coffee, grateful for the warmth that spread through my fingers as I unscrewed the cap. Steam rose from the dark liquid, fogging the lower corner of my windshield briefly before dissipating. As I took my first sip, I noticed other vehicles parked in the shadows beyond the street lamp's reach. Their shapes were indistinct through the rain-streaked glass, but I could make out what looked like several lorries and a few cars, all sitting silent and dark in the gloom. It struck me as odd that I hadn't noticed them when I pulled in. The lay-by had seemed empty then, just a lonely patch of pavement carved from the moor. But truck drivers were a practical lot, and it made sense that others would seek shelter from the storm in the same place. The humming sound grew slightly louder as I sat there, and I found myself straining to identify its source. It had an almost musical quality, rising and falling in subtle harmonies that seemed to resonate in my chest. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to stretch my legs and perhaps exchange a word or two with my fellow travelers. I pulled on my high-visibility jacket and stepped down from the cab into the rain. The water was surprisingly warm against my skin despite the chill in the air, and it seemed to carry with it a strange metallic taste that coated my tongue when I breathed. The first vehicle I approached was an older DAF. Its blue paint faded to a dull gray in the uncertain light. As I drew closer, I could see that its driver was still behind the wheel, his silhouette motionless against the side window. I tapped gently on the glass, calling out a friendly greeting, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. didn't even seem to register my presence. I cupped my hands against the window and peered inside, my breath fogging the glass. The driver was an elderly man with silver hair, his hands resting on the steering wheel in perfect position, his eyes open and staring straight ahead. But there was something deeply unsettling about his stillness, a quality that went beyond simple sleep or rest. His skin had a waxy pallor that seemed to glow faintly in the dashboard lights, and his chest showed no sign of the gentle rise and fall of breathing. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through my jacket. I moved quickly to the next vehicle, a red Volvo with Scottish plates, hoping to find signs of life. But the scene was eerily similar. Another driver, this one a woman with short brown hair, sat motionless behind the wheel with that same unnatural stillness, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance that I couldn't see. The humming grew stronger as I moved from vehicle to vehicle, each one containing its frozen occupant, each driver wearing the same expression of vacant concentration. There were 8 vehicles in total, arranged in a rough semicircle around the perimeter of the lay-by. Cars, lorries, even a motorcycle with its rider still astride it, helmet reflecting the street lamp's glow like a dark mirror. My heart was pounding now, the sound of my pulse loud in my ears as I backed away from the silent congregation of vehicles. The rain seemed to be falling heavier, but it moved strangely around the street lamp, creating patterns in the air that defied the wind. As I watched, transfixed despite my growing terror, I began to see shapes in those patterns, faces that formed and dissolved in the cascading water like memories made manifest. The humming had become a song now, wordless but hauntingly beautiful, emanating from the very ground beneath my feet. I could feel it vibrating through the soles of my boots, resonating in my bones, calling to something deep inside me that wanted nothing more than to surrender to its hypnotic pull. The faces in the rain grew clearer, more distinct, and I recognized the features of the drivers sitting motionless in their vehicle, but these weren't the faces I had seen through their windows. These were younger versions, filled with life and purpose, their lips moving in silent harmony with the song that filled the air. Understanding crashed over me like a cold wave. This wasn't a ley lie at all. It was a trap. A snare set for weary travelers who sought nothing more than a moment's rest from the endless road. The humming was growing stronger, more insistent, and I could feel my own will beginning to waver, my feet wanting to carry me back to my truck, where I could sit behind the wheel and join the eternal vigil of the lost souls who had chosen this place for their final stop. I forced myself to move, each step a tremendous effort against the pull of that hypnotic song. The rain stung my eyes, but I pushed forward, stumbling across the cracked tarmac toward my Scania. Behind me, I could hear something changing, a shift in the quality of the humming that spoke of awakening, of attention finally focused in my direction. I didn't dare look back. My truck seemed impossibly far away, its familiar bulk wavering like a mirage in the supernatural rain. The song was in my head now, beautiful beyond description, promising rest and peace and an end to the endless miles of solitary driving. All I had to do was stop, turn around, and take my place among the chosen few who had found this sanctuary from the harsh world beyond. My hand found the door handle just as something touched my shoulder. Not fingers, nothing so solid as that, but a presence nonetheless, gentle but insistent, urging me to reconsider my hasty departure. I yanked the door open and hauled myself up into the cab, my hand shaking as I turned the key and felt the diesel engine roar back to life. The song rose to a crescendo as I slammed the truck into gear, the voices of the lost souls lifting in what might have been protest or farewell. I didn't look in my mirrors as I accelerated toward the lay-by's exit, afraid of what I might see following in my wake. The entrance, so clearly defined when I had arrived, seemed to blur and shift as I approached it. as if the very boundaries of the place were uncertain, reluctant to let me go. But the truck's momentum carried me through, and suddenly I was back on the A68. Rain drumming normally against my windshield, the yellow lines of the motorway stretching endlessly ahead through the darkness. My radio crackled to life with traffic updates and weather warnings, the mundane voices of dispatchers and fellow drivers grounding me in the reality I had almost lost. I drove for another 2 hours before I dared to stop again, pulling into a well-lit service station bustling with late-night travelers. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, and the world felt solid and normal around me. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes hear echoes of that haunting melody in the drone of my engine. And I find myself scanning the roadside for places that shouldn't exist, laybys that don't appear on any map, where weary souls might find the rest they never knew they were seeking. The A68 still calls to me, as it always has, but now I know to be more careful about where I choose to stop.